From a tiny island off the coast of Europe, one empire grew to control nearly a quarter of the entire world's land and population. Its ships crossed every ocean, its flags flew on every continent, and its legacy, both glorious and devastating, still shapes the world we live in today. Welcome to History Vault, the channel where we unlock the stories that built our civilization. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into one of the most powerful empires history has ever witnessed. From King Alfred fighting off Viking invaders, to the slave ships that crossed the Atlantic in chains, to the moment Hong Kong was handed back to China. This is the complete story of the British Empire. Let's unlock the vault. At its peak, one European empire ended up bringing under its control more than a quarter of the entire world's landmass and population. The groundwork for this colossal power was laid in English territory, where a strong monarchy set in motion an extraordinary saga of exploration, military expansion, and far-reaching domination. The British Empire would later come to symbolize both some of humanity's proudest breakthroughs and greatest accomplishments. Alongside its most troubling and shameful episodes, roughly 5 centuries ago, following the discovery of the Americas, England started pushing outward across the world's oceans. British explorers ran into unfamiliar cultures, building historic partnerships, while also fueling fierce hostilities. In just 4 centuries, the empire would reach an eye-popping valuation of over $600 billion. Yet how did a dominion that sprawled across the Americas, Asia, Africa, and even Australia eventually fall apart? To get to the bottom of that, we have to go all the way back to the very start, long before anyone had any clue about far-off continents. A ruler named King Alfred the Great was locked in a fight to defend his small Anglo-Saxon kingdom from invading Danish Vikings. In the year 878 AD, Viking forces under the command of Guthrum launched a full-scale offensive, forcing Alfred to pull back into the marshlands of Somerset, where he found shelter on the Isle of Athelney. From there, Alfred pulled his supporters together and reignited their loyalty. He reshaped his troops into a well-drilled fighting force and confronted the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. With a crushing victory, Alfred overcame Guthrum and forced him into accepting the Treaty of Wedmore. That agreement laid down the Danelaw, giving official recognition to Viking-held regions of England while simultaneously establishing peace between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons. Afterward, Alfred started bringing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under one umbrella, a mission finished by his grandson, Athelstan, in 924, when Athelstan became King of Wessex. His rule was immediately contested by rival claimants, especially from Viking-controlled Northumbria and Mercia. Even with those dangers looming, Athelstan showed himself to be a skilled and persistent leader. By 927 AD, he had seized Northumbria, effectively welding England into a single kingdom and becoming the first genuine king of England. 2 centuries down the line, England's next confrontation arose when King Henry II tried to stretch his authority into Ireland. During the spring of 1171, Henry II sailed from England to Waterford, Ireland, backed by knights and soldiers. Upon arrival, he acted fast to make his dominance felt, calling on Irish kings and chieftains to submit to him. Henry was deeply convinced that Ireland ought to fall under English control. Reactions among Irish leaders were mixed, but when Irish bishops and clergy gathered at the Synod of Cashel in 1171, they formally acknowledged Henry II as the ruler of Ireland. That recognition marked Ireland as England's first colony centuries before anyone could have imagined England turning into a worldwide empire. Another 100 years slipped by, and in 1277, King Edward I aimed his ambitions at Wales. His wish to absorb Wales into his domain was fueled by strategic, political, and territorial motives. The campaign kicked off with the First Welsh War. In 1277, when Edward launched a determined assault on Gwynedd, the heart of Welsh resistance in North Wales. Despite fierce fighting, the Welsh forces were eventually beaten, and their leader, Prince Llewellyn, was forced to bow to English authority. After securing Gwynedd, Edward concentrated on tightening English control over Wales, realizing that military victory alone wouldn't break Welsh defiance. He rolled out a broader strategy. Central to that plan was the construction of an extensive web of imposing castles across Wales, intended to broadcast English power and keep rebellion in check. Still, Welsh resistance carried on, and in 1282, a second uprising called the Second Welsh War broke out. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting, yet the Welsh were ultimately overpowered. With resistance stamped out, Edward I completed his conquest, formally folding Wales into the English kingdom. England's difficulties were far from finished. Between 1337 and 1453, England and France were entangled in the 100 Years' War. This drawn-out struggle bled both kingdoms dry, and kept England largely boxed into its island. Hardly had that war ended when England plunged into yet another clash, War of the Roses from 1455 to 1487. This bloody civil war pitted the House of Lancaster against the House of York. The Lancastrians came out on top, and Henry VI was proclaimed king. In the meantime, the wider world was starting to open up. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west and landed in the Bahamas. From there, he explored much of the Caribbean, including Cuba and Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, as well as parts of Central and South America, such as Venezuela and Panama. The discovery of this vast new landmass lit a fire under England's interest in overseas expansion. When the Italian explorer Giovanni Caboto approached King Henry VII for backing to find a western sea route to Asia, the English king was intrigued. He granted Caboto a royal patent, giving him the authority to explore and claim any lands he discovered for the English crown. Anglicizing his name to John Cabot, the explorer got ready for his journey. In May 1497, Cabot set out from Bristol aboard a small ship called the Matthew. Leading a crew of around 18 men, the Atlantic crossing was treacherous, marked by unpredictable weather and unknown perils. After weeks at sea, on June 24, 1497, Cabot and his crew caught sight of land along the eastern coast of North America. In a region later called Newfoundland, literally Newfound Land, Cabot came across an unfamiliar environment and likely made contact with indigenous peoples, such as the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, who had lived there for thousands of years. He claimed the territory for England, raising the English flag and taking possession in the crown's name. Although exactly how long he stayed is uncertain, Cabot probably briefly explored the shoreline before heading back to England. Arriving in Bristol in August 1497, he was welcomed as a hero. News of Cabot's voyage spread like wildfire across Europe, fueling excitement and ambition. His success gave England hope of finding a western passage to Asia and competing with other European powers for dominance over lucrative global trade. Encouraged by this achievement, Cabot set off on a second voyage in 1498, likely aiming to push further and reinforce England's claims. What happened to the expedition remains a mystery. Some accounts suggest success, while others claim Cabot and his crew vanished into the ocean. Back in England, King Henry VIII was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Early on, their relationship was stable. Like most kings of that era, Henry stayed loyal to the Catholic Church and was deeply concerned with producing a legitimate male heir to preserve his dynasty. Over time, though, frustration began to set in. Catherine gave birth to only one surviving child, Princess Mary. Henry grew more and more convinced that his lack of a male heir was divine punishment, and that his marriage was invalid. He appealed to the Pope, asking for an annulment on the grounds that Catherine had previously been married to his older brother Arthur. According to Old Testament law, marrying a brother's widow was forbidden, and Henry believed this explained his misfortune. The Pope, however, under pressure from Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of Spain, turned down the request. Furious and desperate, Henry made a historic move. He broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and established an independent English church. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, formally cutting ties with Rome and creating the Church of England, with Henry VIII as its supreme head. Anglicanism was born. After Henry divorced and executed several wives, his daughter Mary I took the throne. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary because of her brutal campaign to restore Catholicism. Her reign was short-lived, however, and her half-sister Elizabeth I soon came to power. Elizabeth re-established Protestantism, passing the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which made her supreme governor of the Church of England. She also enacted the Act of Uniformity, requiring the Book of Common Prayer to be used as official religious practice. Beyond England, the global race for colonies was already in full swing. Under King Philip, Spain built a vast empire across South America, extracting wealth from former Aztec capitals like Tenochtitlan to Incan strongholds such as Machu Picchu, and extending through the Andes into Chile, along Brazil's coast. The Portuguese founded settlements like São Vicente, Pernambuco, and Rio de Janeiro. The French set up colonies in Quebec and small outposts in Florida, including Fort Caroline. The scramble for overseas territory had begun. Queen Elizabeth responded by commissioning a band of aggressive seafarers to expand England's influence. Known as the Sea Dogs, they were authorized to raid and plunder Spanish ships in order to challenge Spanish dominance and raise England's profile on the world stage. One of the first was John Hawkins, a convicted murderer who spared his own life by joining the Royal Navy. In 1561, Hawkins sailed to the Canary Islands, a Spanish possession off the African coast. There, he observed a system that promised enormous profit at a horrific human cost: the capture and sale of enslaved people. Armed with that knowledge, Hawkins set sail again in 1562, traveling along the African coast to Sierra Leone, where he kidnapped 300 Africans and locked them aboard his ship. He then crossed the Atlantic to the Caribbean, lacking legal permission from either Spain or Portugal to trade with their colonies. Hawkins sold the enslaved people in ports such as Isabella, Porto de Plata, and Monte Cristi, places where authorities loosely enforced trade laws. The human cargo was exchanged for pearls, animal hides, and sugar. The trade proved so profitable that when Hawkins got back to England, he was rewarded with a knighthood and granted the title of Sir in October 1564. Hawkins set out on yet another voyage back to Sierra Leone. This time, he seized more than 400 enslaved Africans. Some were purchased from the Portuguese, while others were taken by force during raids along the coastline. He left Africa on January 29, 1565. By April 3, 1565, Hawkins arrived at Boborada in present-day Venezuela. Because trading enslaved people was officially forbidden, he staged a false show of force with the cooperation of the local governor. He then sailed on to Rio de la Hacha, where he used intimidation and military pressure to secure what he considered fair trade agreements. In total, he sold around 300 enslaved people, receiving payment in gold, silver, and other valuables. He even took advance orders for future slave trading expeditions. Hawkins' third slave voyage, however, did not go as smoothly as the first two. Upon reaching the African coast, he found himself unable to acquire captives because of a Portuguese embargo. He tried to raid a village near Cape Verde, but during the attack he was wounded and forced to pull back. Undeterred, Hawkins enlisted the help of a local king in Sierra Leone, who assisted him in forcibly abducting people from surrounding areas. Together, they captured more than 500 individuals. On February 7, 1568, Hawkins set sail across the Atlantic, once again to sell his captives. Some were sold in Margarita province, while others were sold in Borborata. When he reached Rio de la Hacha, the local governor refused to allow any trading. In response, Hawkins and his associate, Francis Drake, opened fire on the governor's house, seized control of the town, and proceeded to sell the enslaved people by force. On the return journey, Hawkins' fleet was driven by a storm into the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua. What followed was chaos. In the midst of what were supposed to be peace negotiations, Spanish cannons suddenly thundered to life, hurling iron shot toward the English ships. Although heavily outnumbered, Hawkins' fleet maneuvered skillfully, dodging incoming fire and responding with cannon blasts of their own. A fierce naval battle erupted as English sailors fought desperately for survival. As the fighting raged on, a grim decision confronted Hawkins and his men: either pull back or spend the rest of their lives chained to oars aboard Spanish galleys. In the end, captivity was the fate of 114 Englishmen, while only 15 others alongside Hawkins managed to slip away and make it back to England, still walking away with a hefty profit. Moral questions aside, the slave trade had shown itself to be immensely profitable, and the English were ready to go to extraordinary lengths to defend it. That same combative mindset drove Queen Elizabeth I to send Francis Drake on a mission in 1577 to hunt for a fresh trade route to Asia. Unlike the explorers who came before him, Drake was already well aware that the Americas stood in the way. Getting around that massive landmass to reach Asia directly was his goal. Drake's journey first took him toward Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America. Howling winds and towering waves battered the fleet, putting the crew's courage and unity to the test. Yet through those treacherous waters, they were carried by Drake's steady leadership and unshakable determination. The Strait of Magellan was successfully navigated, and they emerged into the vast openness of the Pacific Ocean. With the Pacific stretching out before them, the world seemed wide open and full of promise. Northward along the western coast of South America sailed Drake, coming across breathtaking landscapes and remarkable wildlife that filled the crew with wonder. Pushing onward, they eventually reached what is now the California coastline. There, landfall was made in a place of natural beauty and abundance, which was named Nova Albion as a tribute to England, his homeland. The expedition pressed on across the Pacific, reaching Indonesia, back then called the Spice Islands, famous for their valuable and aromatic treasures. Peaceful trade was carried out by Drake and his men with local communities, exchanging goods and stories from far-flung corners of the globe. No less demanding was the return journey, crossing the immense Indian Ocean and navigating unpredictable seas pushed the crew to their breaking point. Yet around the Cape of Good Hope, at Africa's southern tip, they were safely guided by Drake's resourcefulness and determination. After nearly 3 years of exploration and adventure, the Golden Hind finally pulled back into England in September 1580. For his achievements, a knighthood was bestowed upon Francis Drake, who became Sir Francis Drake. Looking across the newly revealed lands of the Americas, the English recognized that permanent settlements in the New World would be needed to grow into a true empire. In 1584, a charter to explore and colonize these distant lands was granted to Sir Walter Raleigh by Queen Elizabeth I. An expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville was sent by Raleigh to Roanoke Island, off the coast of modern-day North Carolina. Roughly 100 men made up the group, including soldiers, scientists, and skilled craftsmen. Arriving in 1585, they began constructing a fort while reaching out to nearby Native American tribes. Friendly relations were established at first, with both sides trading goods and sharing knowledge. Over time, however, tensions began to surface. The settlers' morale was strained by disease, food shortages, and the harsh environment, which also undermined cooperation Amid these hardships, an offer to transport the colonists back to England was made by Sir Francis Drake, who was returning from another successful privateering voyage. Many, disillusioned and exhausted, accepted his offer and left in 1586. Allowing the Roanoke settlement to fall apart, another attempt was made by Raleigh in 1587, sending 118 settlers, but this colony too disappeared without a trace. When investigators returned 3 years later, it had been completely deserted. In 1588, it was believed by Spain's King Philip II that conquering England in the name of Catholicism was his religious duty. To pull that off, the Spanish Armada was dispatched, one of the most formidable naval forces ever assembled. Around 130 ships comprised the Armada, including powerful galleons, which served as the primary warships of the Spanish fleet. More than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines accompanied the fleet. Seasoned veterans were these troops, while the sailors were highly experienced navigators, many of whom had years of combat experience at sea. Any resistance was meant to be overwhelmed by the Armada. With England being brought under Spanish rule across the English Channel, the looming danger was fully recognized by Queen Elizabeth and her advisors. Her trusted naval leaders, Sir Francis Drake and Vice Admiral Charles Howard, were called upon to prepare England's defenses. Fewer and smaller ships were possessed by the English fleet, yet key advantages in maneuverability and long-range firepower were held by it. In the late spring of 1588, toward England sailed the Spanish Armada, brimming with confidence in its strength. A clever strategy was employed by the English. However, using fast, agile ships, the Armada was harassed along the coast, with strikes being made from behind. Volleys fired into the slower Spanish vessels, and then a withdrawal carried out before a counterattack could be launched. As the Armada entered the English Channel, a bold tactic was unleashed by the English. 8 fireships packed with flammable. Panic spread among Spanish crews, who broke formation to avoid the burning vessels. Further weakened was the Armada by this chaos, and a critical advantage was handed to the English. On July 29, 1588, off the coast of France, the decisive Battle of Gravelines took place. There, in a prolonged and brutal confrontation, the Armada was engaged by the English fleet. Innovative tactics, including close quarters fighting with grappling hooks and small arms, were employed by the English to press their advantage. After a full day of relentless combat, an attempt to regroup was made by the battered Spanish fleet. Relentlessly, the English pursued. With supplies dwindling and morale shattered, the Armada began its retreat, trying to sail back to Spain. Catastrophic was the return voyage. A already weakened fleet was devastated by violent storms and treacherous currents. By the time the survivors reached Spain, little more than a shadow of its former power was left of the once mighty Armada. Closer to home, a tightening of its grip on Ireland was sought by England. At the time, 2 main regions divided the island: the Pale and the Gaelic Irish territories. Firmly under English rule was the Pale, centered around Dublin, while largely autonomous remained the Gaelic regions. Governed by traditional Brehon law, in these Gaelic territories, greater control was sought by English authorities, with policies being imposed that threatened local customs and traditions. Resentment and unrest were fueled among the Irish nobility. By this, at the center of this growing tension stood Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, a powerful noble torn between allegiance to the English crown and loyalty to his homeland. Much of Ulster in Northern Ireland was ruled by O'Neill, who grew weary of English demands and could no longer tolerate the suffering imposed on Ireland by foreign rule. Rebellion was chosen by him. Raising his banner, other Gaelic lords were called upon by O'Neill to resist English domination. One of his strongest allies was Hugh O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell, a fierce and respected warrior. United, a powerful alliance was formed by them. Swiftly, the English crown responded. with armies being dispatched led by experienced commanders such as Sir Henry Bagenal. Across the countryside, battles erupted, leaving devastation in their wake. As the conflict dragged on for years, the 9 Years' War is what it came to be known as. Immense hardship was endured by both the Irish and the English. In 1601, just as defeat seemed inevitable, a small Spanish force sent to aid the Irish rebels arrived like a ray of hope. For a brief moment, the balance appeared to shift, but at the Battle of Kinsale, destiny intervened, where a crushing defeat was suffered by Irish and Spanish forces. The dream of independence collapsed. By 1603, the rebellion was over, exhausted, and weakened Irish forces surrendered. Under the Treaty of Mellifont, rebels were pardoned and allowed to keep some lands and religious freedoms. However, the systematic suppression of Gaelic language and culture was paved the way for by the agreement. Discouraged was Catholicism, enforced was Anglicanism, and Ireland was reshaped to align with English identity rather than its Gaelic roots. Yet far beyond its neighbors stretched England's ambitions. Dominance in the New World was sought by it. In 1606, the Virginia Company of London was established to pursue wealth and a route to the Pacific. With King James' approval, London was departed from by 104 settlers on December 20th, 1606. Braving a bitter winter crossing the Atlantic, after months at sea, on May 13th, 1607, a marshy peninsula was arrived at, and a settlement they named Jamestown in honor of their king was founded. At first, idyllic the land appeared dense. Forests, clear rivers, and abundant wildlife promised prosperity. But reality soon set in. A heavy toll was taken by Virginia's oppressive heat and humidity. Rapidly, disease spread. With malaria and dysentery killing many settlers, hunger soon followed. Crops were not ready for harvest. Supplies dwindled, and difficult to cultivate proved the soil. Loomed starvation. Despite these hardships, giving up was refused by the settlers. Tirelessly, they worked, exploring the land in search of food and attempting to form alliances with the Powhatan Confederacy. However, conflicts were caused by communication barriers and mutual mistrust. Compounded the crisis were leadership problems, especially after the departure of their bold leader, John Smith. The winter of 1609-1610, remembered as the starving time, marked the colony's darkest period. Completely, food vanished. Desperation drove settlers to consume horses, pets, and even leather. Still, enough it was not. Decimated the population were disease, famine, and conflict. Against the odds, hope returned when tobacco cultivation was introduced by John Rolfe in Virginia's soil. The crop flourished, transforming Jamestown's fortunes. Immensely profitable, tobacco became, attracting new settlers and securing the colony's survival. Gradually, relations with some Powhatan groups improved, allowing England's first permanent foothold in America to endure. As Jamestown took root, eastward was turned by England's attention. In 1607, merchant William Hawkins was sent to establish trade in India. From Plymouth aboard the Hector with 3 ships, he sailed, carrying traders, diplomats, and goods. After surviving storms and rough seas, the Cape of Good Hope was reached by the fleet before entering the Indian Ocean. By 1608, at Surat, a major trading hub on India's western coast, Hawkins arrived. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir, ruler of a vast and wealthy empire, welcomed the English with interest. Later, in Agra, near the future site of the Taj Mahal, Hawkins met Jahangir. Through interpreters, trade, politics, and culture were discussed by them. Intrigued by English goods was Jahangir, and eager for further relations, an agreement allowing the English East India Company to establish a trading post in Surat resulted from these talks. The official beginning of England's commercial presence in India was marked by this. By 1612, into a full operation had grown the trading post, exchanging Indian textiles, spices, and indigo for English weapons and metal goods. In 1615, at the Grand Court of Emperor Jahangir, English diplomat Sir Thomas Roe arrived. As the Mughal palace was entered by Roe, unmatched splendor overwhelmed him. Brilliant fabrics, exquisite jewels, and the scent of incense filled the air. Left in awe was the English envoy by the magnificence of the Mughal Empire, surrounded by splendor and ceremony. A formal letter from King James I to Emperor Jahangir was presented by Sir Thomas Roe, a symbol of goodwill between their realms. Alongside it, an assortment of rare English gifts was offered, carefully chosen to impress a court renowned for its love of luxury. Struck was Roe by how highly fine craftsmanship and exotic goods were valued by the Mughal elite during the 3 years Roe spent at Jahangir's court. Steadily expanded by England were its commercial reach and political influence across the Indian subcontinent. Back in England, however, unmistakably clear was made by King James of his religious stance. Conformity to Anglicanism was expected of everyone. Those who refused were told to leave. It was at this moment that the idea of America began to take shape, a distant land where freely people could worship without interference from the state, a place where a personal matter was faith, of course, their homes for an unknown and dangerous world would most people never abandon, unless deeply committed to their beliefs were they. Only the most devout, those truly yearning for religious liberty, would dare undertake such a journey. The Pilgrims is what these people came to be known as in mid-July of 1620. Departure from Southampton was prepared for by 2 ships, the English vessel Mayflower and the Dutch ship Speedwell. But just as departure neared, a leak developed in the Speedwell, forcing both ships to return to Dartmouth for repairs. After the work was completed, again they set sail, only for disaster to strike once more. More than 200 miles beyond Land's End, near the southwestern edge of England yet again, the Speedwell began leaking. By early September, hopeless was the situation. Abandoned was the ship, and difficult decisions had to be made about which passengers would continue the voyage. Especially painful was this choice. While the Speedwell lingered in port for repairs, the passengers aboard the Mayflower had been consuming supplies meant to last until the New World was reached. Throughout the delays, no one was allowed ashore. After nearly 3 months of setbacks, alone on September 16, 1620, the Mayflower finally left Plymouth. Stacked against them were the odds to carry wine between England and Bordeaux. Not to cross the vast Atlantic had the ship been designed. Still, by a higher purpose were the passengers driven, to build a new society devoted to God. That faith sustained them as below deck in the dim, airless space they huddled. Violently, the ship was hurled by storm-driven waves, with men clinging to their wives, and wives clutching their children. Everything above and below was drenched by water. Midway through the journey, nearly disabled became the ship. Its main support beam was shattered by a powerful storm, and even seasoned sailors feared the voyage was lost. Then fortune intervened. A metal jack screw purchased in Holland for building homes in the new settlement was carried by one of the passengers. Used to brace the damaged beam was this device, preventing further cracking and preserving the ship's seaworthiness. Despite overcrowding, sickness, and filth, on November 21st, Cape Cod was reached by the Mayflower. Having lost only 1 life, the Plymouth colony was established. But their luck soon ran out. By December, through the Cay passengers, illness swept. Violent coughing and scurvy ravaged the group. By March, only 47 colonists remained alive. Yet the Pilgrims endured. Shelters were built by them, and they survived, refusing to vanish entirely. Not long after Plymouth was founded, explorer Thomas Warner sought to expand English influence into the tropical Caribbean. On January 28, 1624, an island was landed on by him, and the colony of St. Christopher, modern-day St. Kitts, was founded. In 1625, The settlement was joined by French Captain Pierre Balin d'Esnambach, creating a joint English-French colony. Not purely friendly was Warner's acceptance of the French, but native Kalinago, or Carib, population was feared by him. 1626. A secret council with other chiefs was held by Kalinago leader Ubutu Tegramanti, and on the night of the next full moon, the Europeans were planned to be attacked. A woman named Barbe Enigneri, who had recently been enslaved after Kalinago. Raids on an Arawak island exposed the plot. First, the English and French struck. A surprise night attack was launched by them, killing between 100 and 120 Kalinago in their sleep. Only the most beautiful women were spared, forced into slavery. The next day, roughly 4,000 Kalinago were rounded up by settlers and slaughtered as they attempted to surrender. At what became known as Bloody Point, the corpses rotted in piles. Red ran the nearby river, earning the name Bloody River. Survivors fled to neighboring islands, with the native population destroyed. A new problem emerged. Who would perform the brutal labor required for tobacco farming? Certainly not Europeans. Africa was the solution. Demand for enslaved labor exploded. Continued across the Caribbean did English expansion. Barbados was settled in 1625, Nevis in 1627, Montserrat and Antigua in 1632. Determined to profit were the British. Back in England, more and more intolerable had life become for radical Protestant groups. When the throne was taken by King Charles I in 1625, intensified was his hostility toward non-Anglicans. As an escape, America was increasingly seen by Puritan leaders, both religious and commercial figures driven by persecution. When Parliament was dissolved by Charles in 1629, and for 11 years he ruled alone. Boiled over did Puritan anger. Liberty was what they wanted. Tyranny was what Charles offered. Under the leadership of Minister John Winthrop, exile was chosen by them. On April 8, 1630, the Isle of Wight was departed from by 11 ships, with Winthrop and 700 settlers aboard. Later that year, upon arriving in Salem, Massachusetts, a sermon, a model of Christian charity, was delivered by Winthrop that would echo through American history. Not merely a profit-driven enterprise was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Chosen to reshape the world was what its founders believed. Under strict moral discipline they would live, as a shining example, a city upon a hill. Over the next decade, the Atlantic was crossed by roughly 20,000 Puritans during what became known as the Great Migration. Soon, outward were settlers. Pushed by disagreements, Connecticut was founded by Thomas Hooker. Rhode Island was established by Roger Williams. Where religious tolerance flourished, Anglican pressure was faced by others too. His own vision was pursued by Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore. Granted a charter in 1632, Maryland was founded by him in honor of Queen Henrietta Maria. Never was the colony visited by Calvert himself, but in 1634, across the ocean were carried settlers by two ships, the Ark and the Dove. St. Mary's City was founded together by Catholics seeking freedom and Protestants seeking opportunity. Even Scotland resisted Anglican control. Firm stood the Presbyterian Covenanters. When 20,000 troops were sent by Charles to Edinburgh in 1639, at Berwick they were halted by a Scottish force of 16,500 men. Temporarily, Charles backed down. In India, rapidly expanded the East India Company. In 1639, land on the Coromandel coast was secured by agents Francis Day and Andrew Cogan. A modest trading post emerged, Fort St. George, slowly fortified. Slowly transformed into power, meanwhile, Ireland erupted. Dispossessed were Catholics. Their land was taken by Protestant settlers. In 1641, rebellion followed. On all sides, atrocities erupted. Eventually, the Confederate Catholics of Ireland formed, seeking autonomy under King Charles I. But already, the British Isles had been consumed by war. On January 4, 1642, An attempt was made by Charles to arrest 5 members of Parliament: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Hasselrig, and William Strode. Months later, with the 19 propositions, a direct challenge to royal authority, Parliament responded. If accepted, Parliament would rule fade with the monarchy. 6. All laws targeting Jesuits, Catholic priests, and Catholic recusants must be rigorously enforced. 7. Stripped of their voting rights shall be Catholic lords, and raised and educated within the Protestant faith must be Catholic children. 18. Formally cleared by King Charles must be the 5 members of the House of Commons, along with Lord Kimbolton, of all alleged wrongdoing. Although loyalty to King Charles continued to be professed by the Catholic members of the Irish Confederation, increasingly outraged grew Parliament by what it saw as the King's disregard for the authority of the Anglican Church. A complete reversal of this position was demanded by them. Defiantly, Charles responded, writing, "For all these reasons, and to every one of these demands, our answer is, nolimus leges Angli mutari. We are unwilling to change the laws of England." As a breaking point was reached by tensions, allies began to be rallied by both factions, and their armies were prepared. By autumn, the setting for a momentous confrontation became the open countryside near Edgehill between royalist forces loyal to King Charles and parliamentarian troops fighting for parliamentary power. At dawn on October 23rd, facing one another stood the two armies, with the air heavy with anticipation and dread. A fearsome reputation for bold and reckless charges had been earned by the royalist cavalry, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Opposing him was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, a veteran commander leading the parliamentarian army. As the battle began, forward thundered Rupert's cavaliers, smashing through the parliamentarian left flank and throwing it into chaos. Poised for victory seemed the royalists at first, yet by their infantry, the breakthrough was failed to be exploited. Though shaken, the parliamentarian forces managed to regroup and strike back. Brutal, close-quarters fighting followed brother against brother, friend against friend. After 2 days of bloodshed, victorious emerged neither side. Truly underway was the English Civil War, with no one willing to back down. Early success for the Royalists was brought by the next year. A swift victory was secured by them at Braddock Down in the south, followed by another triumph at Stratton, cementing control over Cornwall. Continued to demonstrate his skill did Prince Rupert at Chalgrove Field, though a shadow over the engagement was cast by the death of parliamentarian hero John Hampden. Further royalist victories at Adwalton Moor and Roundway Down reinforced the belief that unstoppable was their cause. By year's end, even the critical city of Bristol had fallen under royalist control. But a turning point was marked by 1644. From its failures, Parliament had learned at Marston Moor. That lesson was proven, where a devastating defeat was suffered by the royalist forces, losing their hold over northern England. Under commanders such as Oliver Cromwell, the balance of power began to shift. Later that year, again clashed both sides at the First Battle of Newbury. Much like Edgehill, without a clear victor the engagement ended. Yet an even more decisive confrontation loomed the Battle of Naseby. As the sun rose on June 14, 1645, thick in the air hung tension. Only miles apart stood the two armies. Another success was expected by the Royalists, hardened by past victories, but transformed had the parliamentarians. Reorganized under Cromwell's new model army, a disciplined and well-trained force unlike any before it. With cannon fire, the battle opened, smoke billowing across the battlefield. At first, the upper hand appeared to be gained by royalist cavalry charges. Yet his counterstroke had been prepared by Cromwell, his elite cavalry unit, the Ironsides, famed for discipline and resolve. As forward pushed the royalist horsemen, with ferocity the Ironsides struck back. With coordinated movement and unified shouts, the momentum was reversed by the parliamentarian forces. Through royalist ranks tore Cromwell's troops, eventually capturing King Charles himself. For high treason, the king was placed on trial. Standing in Westminster Hall, his rule was defended by Charles I, but guilty was the verdict. On a cold winter morning, the executioner's blade fell, ending royal absolutism and ushering in the age of Oliver Cromwell. A committed Puritan, Oliver Cromwell shared the belief held by his counterparts in Massachusetts that by Charles and the Royalist cause, the Anglican Church had been corrupted. Under the new governing body, the Rump Parliament General was Cromwell appointed and ordered to crush the Irish Confederacy. In his view, undermined by Catholic doctrine was the authority of the Bible, and forcibly suppressed it needed to be. Landing in Dublin on August 15, 1649, the fortified ports of Drogheda and Wexford were captured by him to secure supply routes from England. At Drogheda, in September 1649, nearly 3,500 people were slaughtered by Cromwell's army after the town fell, including about 2,700 Royalist soldiers, as well as civilians, prisoners, and Catholic clergy. Another massacre followed at Wexford in October. Roughly 2,000 Irish soldiers and 1,500 civilians were killed. In ruins was the town left. In May 1650, Ireland was departed from by Cromwell after Scotland proclaimed Charles II king. To Cromwell, war was demanded by this act. On September 3, 1650, the main Scottish army at Dunbar was crushed by him, with 4,000 men killed, 10,000 more captured, and Edinburgh seized. The following year, an attempt to invade England was made by Charles II and his allies, while in Scotland was Cromwell engaged. South, Cromwell pursued them, and at Worcester, on September 3, 1651, their forces were annihilated, the final major royalist resistance. Back in Ireland, under Generals Henry Ireton and Edmund Ludlow, methodically destroyed was Irish resistance. In April 1652, Galway surrendered, and in April 1653, the last Catholic forces capitulated. After the conquest, banned was public Catholic worship. When captured, executed were priests. All Catholic land was seized under the Act for the Settlement of Ireland, 1652, and redistributed to English and Scottish settlers, parliamentary soldiers, and financial backers. In Scotland, outlawed was Presbyterianism, and adherence to Anglicanism was enforced. In 1653, Lord Protector was Oliver Cromwell named, with power consolidated. The British Isles in England's image were sought by him to be reshaped. The Highland clan system was despised by him, and entirely it was dismantled. Before Cromwell, communally to clans belonged land. This was replaced by him with individual land ownership. With deeds granted to clan chiefs alone, a new Scottish aristocracy was created by this, and the rest of the population was impoverished. Profit replaced community survival. Clear-cut were forests, with the ancient rainforest reduced to barren hills. Agriculture was replaced by sheep farming, and into poverty were former clansmen pushed. Superior was England's way, a model to impose upon others, believed by Cromwell. As progress, this is viewed by some. As cultural destruction, it is seen by others. Overseas, Spanish power was also sought to be weakened by Cromwell. In 1655, the Western design in the Caribbean was launched by him. Disastrously, an attack on Santo Domingo failed. By disease, the army was weakened and retreated. Jamaica was turned to instead. In May 1655, the island was seized by English troops, overrunning its defenders. Never was it reclaimed by Spain. As a penal colony, Jamaica was used by Cromwell, with prisoners and dissenters sent to labor as indentured servants on sugar plantations. Growth was slowed by disease and harsh conditions. By 1660, gone was Cromwell, resumed the race for empire. To the throne, Charles II was restored, and set out to project English power worldwide. The Company of Royal Adventurers, trading into Africa, was created by him. granting it monopolies over gold and the lucrative slave trade. In America, Carolina, named for himself, was founded by him, granting vast territories to 8 nobles as a buffer against Spanish Florida. Then, on the Dutch, the English turned. Key forts along the African coast were seized by Captain Robert Holmes. By 1664, New Amsterdam was captured by English forces. New York was the colony renamed. Dutch Admiral Michel de Ruyter responded, with African forts reclaimed and English shipping attacked, but ultimately, New York was failed to be retaken. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 formally transferred New Netherland to England, while to Dutch control returned Suriname. With Dutch resistance neutralized, onward surged English expansion, but controversy awaited in Canada, where beyond royal permission, opportunity was sought by French fur traders Radisson and Groseilliers. By French authorities, they were arrested. Instead, to England they turned, and ultimately the support of Prince Rupert, cousin to King Charles II, was secured in 1668. 2 vessels, the Nonsuch and the Eaglet, were secured by an English venture to investigate commercial opportunities in Hudson Bay. Aboard the Nonsuch, under the command of Captain Zachariah Gillam, sailed Groseilliers, while the Eaglet was captained by William Stannard and carried Radisson. On June 5, 1668, from Deptford in England, both ships departed. However, near the coast of Ireland, the Eaglet was forced to turn back. Alone, the Nonsuch pressed onward, sailing into James Bay, the southern extension of Hudson Bay. There, later in 1668, the first permanent trading post on Hudson Bay, Charles Fort, was established by the crew at the mouth of the Rupert River. Following a productive trading winter in 1669, on October 9th, to England returned the Nonsuch, carrying the first shipment of furs obtained through Hudson Bay trade to Thomas Glover, one of London's leading fur merchants. Most of these furs were sold for £1,233. When adjusted for modern inflation, approximately £188,000. Today would be worth that sum, with proof of both feasibility and profit. Exclusive trading rights to all lands drained by rivers flowing into Hudson Bay were awarded by King Charles II to a new enterprise, the Hudson's Bay Company, a corporation that remains active to this day. Back in New England, at an accelerating pace, English settlements were expanding. In 1624, a population of only 180 people was had by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By 1675, to 64,000 had that number exploded. As the population surged, so too did the demand for land, food, and natural resources. Beyond their small settlements, colonists began spreading to sustain themselves. Within the ancestral territory of the Wampanoag Confederacy sat their informal capital, Plymouth. Initially, cooperative were relations between the Wampanoag and the English Pilgrims. Over time, however, tensions grew due to fundamentally incompatible views of land ownership. Attempts to define territorial boundaries failed. By individuals holding legal deeds, land could be privately owned. That was the English belief. As a communal resource meant to be shared, land was viewed by native peoples. When land was attempted to be purchased by the English, often confused by the transaction with a Wampanoag, from their perspective, unlawfully taken had been their land by their neighbors. In 1675, finally erupted tensions. 3 Wampanoag men accused of murdering John Sassaman, a Native American convert to Christianity, were executed by English authorities. The Wampanoag, who were led by Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, were enraged by the executions. His warriors were rallied by Metacom, and against English settlements, attacks were launched. Beginning in Swansea and spreading to Taunton, Brookfield, and Deerfield, by winter, the violence was not halted. Through hunger, disease, and brutal weather, both sides suffered. Metacom's alliance was joined by native tribes and intensified. Did combat? Forcefully, the English retaliated, culminating in the infamous Battle of Great Swamp, where a fortified Narragansett settlement was captured at tremendous cost to both sides. Unpredictably shifted alliances. With the Mohawk, English leaders negotiated, hoping to weaken Metacon's coalition. Destroyed were native villages, displaced families, and lost countless lives. Until 1676, his alliance was held together by Metacon, when by John Alderman, once his trusted friend, he was assassinated, known as a praying Indian for his Christian faith. With Metacon's death, collapsed native resistance. By August 1676, officially ended the war, leaving devastation on both sides. With the Treaty of Costco, the conflict concluded, which permitted English settlers to remain on native lands. In exchange, an annual tribute of 1 peck of corn equal to 2 dry gallons was required to be paid by each English family, a negligible amount for Massachusetts farmers. Meanwhile, in England, another religious movement challenged Anglican authority. The Quakers. The idea of the inner light was one of their most radical beliefs, the conviction that a divine spark was possessed by every person, enabling direct communication with God without the need for priests, bishops, or kings. All formal titles were rejected by Quakers. By their first name, everyone was addressed kings, nobles, parents, simply. Charles was King Charles, even by name. Their parents were called by children. From mainstream society, this rejection of hierarchy alienated them. A safe haven was sought by William Penn, a place where Quakers could live freely. Conveniently, Penn's father was owed a debt of £16,000 by King Charles II, equivalent to £8 million today. Instead of cash, land in the New World was requested by Penn on March 4, 1681. The request was approved by Charles, founding the colony of Pennsylvania. When aboard the Welcome in October 1682, Penn arrived, a settlement named from the Greek Philio Adelphos. The city of brotherly love was established by him. Philadelphia would be this city, a society where all people, regardless of race, religion, creed, or gender, could thrive without persecution, was envisioned by Penn. In theory, as equals could meet a white man and a black man. A holy experiment. Was this vision called by Penn, rooted in the Quaker belief that in God's eyes, all individuals are equal, following the death of Charles II in 1685. Again into turmoil plunged England. A committed Catholic was his successor, James II. Religious tolerance was promoted by James, but furiously reacted Protestants when Catholics were appointed by him to high offices, violating the Test Act. By the birth of James's son, fears were intensified. To establish a permanent Catholic dynasty threatened his Catholic heir, alarming the Protestant establishment. A secretive group known as the Immortal Seven feared that toward absolutism, the monarchy was drifting, undermining Parliament and the rule of law. To Prince William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, they turned. In 1688, to England sailed William. As allies defected, rapidly collapsed James's support, fearing assassination. Under cover of night to France fled James. With the throne vacant, power was accepted by William and Mary. The opportunity was seized by Parliament, and in 1689, the Bill of Rights was passed, cementing parliamentary supremacy, limiting royal authority, and safeguarding individual liberties. Soon, America was reached by news of the Glorious Revolution. In April 1689, in New York, Protestant settlers rebelled against Catholic governor Jacob Leisler and seized Fort James, forming a provisional government in William and Mary's name. In Massachusetts, in Boston, colonists overthrew Governor Sir Edmund Andros, arresting him and restoring their former government while pledging loyalty to the new monarchs. As an attack on Catholic power and papal authority, these events were viewed by France. But soon, isolated found itself France, England, the Dutch Republic, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire united in the Grand Alliance. In 1690, in a French victory in the Spanish Netherlands, the Battle of Fleurus ended, securing key territories. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the deposed James II was defeated by William III at the Battle of the Boyne, cementing Protestant control of England and Ireland. Globally, the war spread. To capture Port Royal in Acadia, English forces attempted and failed on English settlements in Maine. French and Abenaki allies launched raids, battles such as the Siege of Pemaquid were shaped by indigenous alliances. Also failed an English attempt to seize Quebec, reinforcing the colonial boundary between English and French territories. On September 20, 1697, the 9 Years' War was ended by the Treaty of Ryswick, as England's ruler, William of Orange, was formally recognized by the treaty, and French aggression was halted, while in Europe and the Americas war raged. Its first conflict in India was simultaneously fought by England, where a powerful trade monopoly was held by the English East India Company. Control of Chittagong was sought to be gained by the company, a fortified stronghold established across the region, and independently of the surrounding Suba operated by removing Mughal authority through domination of local governors and the Hooghly River. However, these English demands were outright rejected by Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in response. Its navy was dispatched by the East India Company to blockade multiple Mughal ports along India's western coastline. And openly Mughal forces were engaged. Key cities such as Chittagong, Madras and Bombay were disrupted by the blockade. Directly to intervene, this escalation compelled Aurangzeb. The seizure of all East India Company factories was ordered by him, and members of the company's military forces were arrested. In 1690, a Mughal fleet based in Janjira, commanded by Sidi Yaqub, surrounded the East India Company's fort at Bombay. After enduring nearly a year of siege, marked by starvation and desperation, inside the fort the company capitulated. To Aurangzeb's court, envoys were sent to beg forgiveness and request the restoration of trade privileges, to prostrate themselves before the emperor and pay a substantial imperial fine of 150,000 rupees, equivalent to roughly 4 million today. The company's representatives were forced. Following this submission, the siege was instructed to be lifted by Aurangzeb from Sidi Yaqub. Then, in Bombay, the East India Company was allowed to re-establish itself, and a new trading center in Calcutta went on to be created, back in England. When in 1702, William was succeeded by Queen Anne, highly unusual was the political framework of the British Isles. 4 kingdoms, 3 separate parliaments, and a single monarch existed there. Its own parliament and legal system was maintained by Scotland, while under the authority of the British Crown remaining. Its own parliament was also possessed by Ireland, though ultimately to the monarch its laws answered. A unified parliament was shared by England and Wales, as into English political and cultural life. Wales had been largely absorbed by 1707. With deep economic hardship fueled by corruption, dwindling resources, and an increasingly dominant elite class, Scotland was struggling. Their influence would grow if with England's its parliament was merged by Scotland, that was believed by wealthy Scottish power brokers. Widespread became bribery. About £20,000 each, around £4 million today, were paid to officials such as David Boyle, the Earl of Glasgow, and James Douglas, the 2nd Duke of Queensberry, to dissolve the Scottish Parliament. Decision was despised by the general population, but no means to stop it were had. On May 1, 1707, formally united the Scottish and English parliaments, creating the Parliament of Great Britain, headquartered at Westminster in London. With this act, meaningful Scottish independence vanished, while across Scotland resentment simmered. No resistance followed. For England, however, the concept of Great Britain was given rise to by this parliamentary union, and the true beginning of the British Empire was marked. Although relations between England and France were aimed to be stabilized by the Treaty of Ryswick, Short-lived proved peace. By 1707, conflict resumed, largely over colonial disputes. In the Americas, tied to a looming succession crisis in Spain, gravely ill and childless was King Charles II of Spain. Two rival claimants emerged: Archduke Charles of Austria from the Habsburg dynasty, and Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince, with close ties to France's King Louis XIV. That a united French and Spanish monarchy would dramatically expand Catholic dominance worldwide was feared by England. As a result, war was declared by England. Though by a dynastic dispute sparked, the conflict ultimately reshaped global colonial power on American soil. The first battle fought took place at Fort Albany. The English trading post was targeted by French commander Claude de Ramezay, intent on eliminating it. Limited protection was offered by the fort's wooden walls and palisades. Inside, for the inevitable assault, English traders and soldiers prepared. Overwhelmed by heavy French cannon fire were the defenses, forcing the fort's surrender. Still, as English and French settlers battled over territory in Acadia's unforgiving wilderness, the struggle continued. By commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch, English forces were led to secure the region for the crown. At Port Royal, offshore, appeared English warships, their cannons ready. To the French stronghold, colonial troops laid siege. Inside, a determined French defense was commanded by Governor Daniel Dogger de Subercase. As artillery thundered and muskets cracked, days blurred into nights. Eventually, negotiations began. On a clear October day, above the walls, white flags rose. On October 5, 1710, surrendered Subercase, marched in English troops. Lowered was the French flag, and raised was the Union Jack. Now under English control was Acadia, and renamed Annapolis Royal in honor of Queen Anne, whose reign marked this historic transition. As the war concluded in the Netherlands, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed. As King of Spain, Philip V was officially recognized. Yet the most significant provision was the Asinto de Negros, which granted England enormous economic leverage. Through this monopoly system, the transportation of enslaved Africans had long been outsourced by Spain, previously held by France. As part of the peace agreement, the contract was transferred to England, positioning Britain as a dominant force in the brutal transatlantic slave trade. Also forced by the treaty was France to relinquish Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and territories in Rupert's Land. Gibraltar and Minorca were surrendered by Spain. While in Europe empire was debated by diplomats, transforming were the Carolinas. Into North and South Carolina, the once unified colony split. With fertile land suitable for sugar cultivation and access to abundant resources, far more valuable than its northern counterpart became South Carolina. Demand for increased production was driven by its prosperity, which in turn intensified reliance on enslaved labor. In 1712, the infamous slave codes were enacted by South Carolina. The harsh ideology of slave owners and their perceived rights were outlined by these laws: to be barbarous, wild, and savage, unfit to be governed by colonial law, declared the code enslaved Africans. Brutal measures were enforced by it. Without white supervision or permission, enslaved people could not leave plantations. To punish slaves found away unlawfully, any white person was obligated. By death, escape attempts were punishable. For 20 days absent faced public whipping, branding on the cheek for a second offense, ear removal for a third, and castration for a fourth. A grim precedent across the colonies was set by these laws. To agricultural instruments, enslaved people were reduced, valued solely for profit. At the time, in North America, about 40,000 enslaved individuals lived. In the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, due to sugar cultivation, far higher was the demand. Grueling was sugarcane farming, in extreme heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Enslaved laborers cleared land, planted stalks. Repeatedly, maintained vast plantations, dug irrigation canals, and after more than a year harvested cane. Relentless was the work, often 18 hours a day, and from exhaustion, malnutrition, and heat, many died. To sustain labor demands, approximately 200,000 Africans between 1710 and 1720 were forcibly transported by England. At a horrifying cost, it turned out, came sugar, back in England. A colony for the worthy poor, those trapped by debt and poverty, was envisioned by James Oglethorpe. A choice was given to debtors: imprisonment or relocation to Georgia's marshlands. In November 1732, the ship Anne in Gravesend was boarded by Oglethorpe and 143 others. On February 12, 1733, in Savannah they arrived. Unlike neighboring colonies, slavery was prohibited by Georgia. Large plantations were banned. Small plots designed to sustain families rather than generate vast wealth were farmed by settlers. Not opulence, but stability, a modest, dignified life for ordinary people was Oglethorpe's goal. Another major concern surrounding the introduction of slavery was the presence of Spanish Florida, freedom to any enslaved African who escaped. British territory crossed the border, and pledged military service had been openly promised by Spanish authorities. If slavery were legalized, there would be little preventing enslaved people from fleeing, supplying the Spanish army, and strengthening Spain's foothold in North America. Despite these tensions between Britain and Spain, conflict was already brewing, even before Georgia officially became a colony in 1731, for attacking Spanish ships and seizing their cargo. Notoriety had been gained by British merchant captain Robert Jenkins. During one such encounter, by a Spanish privateer, Jenkins was captured. As punishment, his ear was sliced off by the Spaniards. The severed ear to the British Parliament was later presented by Jenkins, sparking outrage across England and fueling public calls for retaliation. For nearly 8 years, through diplomacy, their differences were attempted to be resolved by both empires. But in January 1740, collapsed negotiations south into Spanish Florida. British forces were led by James Oglethorpe, successfully capturing two forts, Fort Picolata and Fort San Francisco de Pupo. By the victories encouraged, deeper into Florida to seize St. Augustine considered pressing Oglethorpe, however, insufficient for such an assault, realizing his troops. To Georgia, he withdrew to prepare for a counterattack. In the summer of 1742, that retaliation came. On the southern tip of St. Simon's Island, Spanish forces landed, assembling for an attack on the British stronghold at Fort Frederica Soon. A Spanish scouting unit was encountered by British Rangers, and personally by Oglethorpe. A charge was led that forced the Spanish soldiers to flee, while to Fort Frederica Oglethorpe returned. Hastily by his troops, the road leading to the fort was fortified to block further advances. A second clash soon followed, later remembered as the Battle of Bloody Marsh. Forward pushed Spanish reinforcements, but were met by English resistance, with the Spanish retreating back toward the coast and eventually returning to St. Augustine. The fighting ended. Not confined to North America was the War of Jenkins' Ear. Thousands of miles away to southern India, specifically the Carnatic region, its reach extended. There, by Indian allies under Anwar backed, one claimant to the Carnatic throne was supported by the British. Opposing them were the French, led by the ambitious Governor-General Joseph Francois Dupleix, who had allied with Chanda Sahib, a rival contender. In 1744, tensions erupted, igniting the long-simmering colonial rivalry. A turning point was marked by the Battle of Adyar, when using superior tactics, decisively defeated by French forces were the British. In the Carnatic, significantly boosted was French influence by the victory. Riding this momentum in 1746 to the British-held city of Madras, French troops laid siege. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, to surrender the city, the British were forced, however, due to major fighting in Europe, particularly in the contested Austrian territories soon shifted the course of events. Control was sought by Prussia, France, Spain, the Dutch, and various independence movements, eager to assert influence, with the Dutch to support their claim. Britain allied. In the summer of 1747, at the Battle of Lauffeld, these tensions culminated. By the Duke of Cumberland, British, Dutch, and Austrian forces were led attempting to break through French defenses, commanded by the brilliant Maurice de Saxe. Failed the assault, and without a decisive victor, the battle ended. Still, more than battlefield victories, diplomacy ultimately shaped the outcome. When in 1748 hostilities concluded, largely to their pre-war status, borders were restored by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Despite its earlier capture, to British control Madras was returned, along the St. Johns River. A defined border between English Georgia and Spanish Florida was also formally established by the treaty. Meanwhile, under the rule of Maria Theresa, as an independent state, Austria emerged. In the aftermath, the issue of slavery was revisited by Georgia. Firmly opposed remained Oglethorpe, but from South Carolina, illegal slave imports proved impossible. To stop, prosperity, not permanent hardship, had been hoped for by the original settlers, known as the worthy poor. On January 1, 1751, under a system nearly identical to South Carolina's, slavery was officially legalized. Ironically, the very people Georgia was meant to protect were harmed by this decision. Capital and resources that Georgia's original settlers lacked were possessed by wealthy migrants from South Carolina. Familiar social and economic hierarchies were quickly recreated by them. Within 2 decades, nearly half of the colony's rapidly growing enslaved population was controlled by approximately 60 plantation owners, dominating Georgia's low-country rice economy. Yet not universal across the American colonies was slavery. Far to the northwest lay the Ohio Valley, a vast 300,000-acre region rich in forests, fur-bearing animals, and economic potential. To exploit these resources, the Ohio Company of Virginia was founded by Augustine Washington, father of George Washington, to survey and map the company's land claims. A young George Washington was assigned. What was discovered by him troubled British authorities. Already inhabited by the Shawnee and Delaware peoples, both hostile to British expansion, was the region. Also well entrenched were the French, operating a profitable fur trade network, protected by a chain of forts, including Fort Duquesne, at the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela Rivers, modern-day Pittsburgh. By April 1754, to act with the British, prompted by rising tensions. With a small force to secure the valley, 22-year-old George Washington was sent, deep in the wilderness, upon a secluded clearing known as Jumonville Glen. His men came there. A small French detachment, led by Joseph Cowland de Jumonville, was encountered. What followed remains controversial. On the morning of May 28, 1754, fighting broke out, and killed was Jumonville. During combat he died, claimed the British, while a deliberate assassination it was, insisted the French, outraged by surrounding Washington and his troops, who had fallen back to a crude fortification known as Fort Necessity. French forces retaliated, outnumbered and trapped. On July 3, 1754, Washington surrendered. A document written in French was included in the surrender terms, in which to assassinating Jumonville Washington unknowingly admitted. Now unavoidable was war. Soon after, Saxony was invaded by Prussian King Frederick II, signaling the beginning of a massive global conflict. The First True World War became the 7 Years' War, stretching across Europe, the Americas, and India. For global dominance, European empires fought, while for survival in a rapidly changing world, indigenous nations struggled. Early setbacks were suffered by Britain in India. Fort William in Calcutta, the main stronghold of the British East India Company, was captured by Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the governor of Bengal. Into a small dungeon overnight, British prisoners, 146 in total, were crammed, according to survivor John Howell. Due to suffocation, heat, and dehydration, 123 died as the Black Hole of Calcutta. The site became infamous. Across Britain, the news ignited outrage. To reassert control, determined was British officer Robert Clive, who assembled a force to confront Siraj-ud-Daulah at the village of Plassey in June 1757. A numerical advantage was held by Siraj, and on both armies, the oppressive heat weighed heavily. Yet a hidden advantage was possessed by Clive: betrayal, with disaffected officials including Mir Jafar, who harbored ambitions of power he had secretly allied. As the battle unfolded, faltered Siraj's forces. At a critical moment, defected Mir Jafar's troops, sealing Siraj's fate. Captured and executed was he. And as governor, a ruler firmly under British control, Mir Jafar was installed. Only months later, at Nagapattinam in Maratha territory, another confrontation erupted. On the strategic port, French forces under the Comte de Lally advanced, but ready stood British and Maratha allies. Offshore, naval clashes erupted as cannon fire was exchanged by fleets, while coordinated land assaults pressed the French defenses. The combined strength of British naval dominance, disciplined ground forces, and Maratha military support proved decisive. Devastating losses were suffered by the French, leaving their position in India critically weakened. Meanwhile, in North America, to defend their remaining positions, the French stood ready. What was not anticipated by them was a bold British offensive led by General Geoffrey Amherst against the heavily fortified port of Louisbourg on Canada's eastern coastline. With a devastating naval barrage, the siege began. Opened fire British warships, with cannonballs screaming through the sky as they slammed into the fortress walls. Day after day echoed the thunder of artillery as the bombardment relentlessly wore down the defenses and exhausted the garrison inside. By June 23, 1758, the moment of reckoning arrived. Through the breaches poured British soldiers, with muskets blazing and bayonets fixed, fiercely resisted the French defenders. But too much proved the sustained pressure. One position after another fell, and from French control the fortress was wrested. Just weeks later, on July 8th, another ambitious assault on Fort Caroline, located in present-day New York, was launched by British General James Abercrombie. With a massive force and detailed battle plans, inevitable was believed by the British to be victory. However, into a formidable defense, Fort Caroline had been transformed by French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, surrounded by thick forests and rugged terrain as both a military installation and a natural barrier. The fortress functioned with determination. The attack opened, thundered cannons, fired muskets, and clashed steel as British regulars and colonial troops advanced, yet firm held the French lines. Disciplined and resolute, Montcalm's soldiers repelled wave after wave of attacks. Despite repeated efforts to break through, the British failed. Unshaken stood Fort Caroline as casualties mounted. The grim choice to withdraw was made by Abercrombie. The following year, in 1759, under General Amherst, the British returned. This time, careful preparation and favorable circumstances allowed them to capture the fort with relative ease. Renaming it Fort Ticonderoga, with that victory secured, to a far greater prize turned British attention. Quebec. An initial attempt to lay siege to the city was made by Major General James Wolfe, alongside Admiral Charles Saunders. Unprepared for the challenge, temporarily they pulled back. Inside Quebec, for an inevitable confrontation, Montcalm and his troops braced themselves. On September 13, 1759, that decisive moment arrived. A daring strategy was devised by Wolfe. Under cover of darkness, steep, seemingly impossible cliffs were scaled by British troops, and silently onto the plains of Abraham they emerged. At dawn, into a brief but savage firefight that would determine the fate of New France. The battle erupted. In the chaos, both commanders Wolfe and Montcalm were struck down, mortally wounded. Just long enough to learn that his forces had secured victory lived Wolfe. To the British belonged the Plains of Abraham, but immense was the cost among them. Wolfe's life, with Quebec encircled and supplies running dangerously low, collapsed French resistance. On September 18, 1759, to British control surrendered Quebec, the heart of New France. Across the globe in India, unraged conflict in Madras by French forces under General Thomas Lally Tollendal. The aim was to drive the British from the subcontinent altogether. By allies from the Kingdom of Mysore reinforced with relentless energy amid oppressive heat, they advanced on the city. Artillery fire, musket volleys, smoke, and dust filled the battlefield, as in the balance hung Madras. By Colonel Eyre Coote, the British defenders mounted a stubborn defense. Repeatedly against British lines, French assaults crashed, and for hours, uncertain remained the outcome. As evening approached, suddenly shifted the tide. A decisive counterattack was launched by Coote that tore into the French center. British discipline, coordinated musket fire, and artillery shattered the French momentum, forcing them to retreat. Soon after, south to Wandiwa shifted fighting. By now, an experienced commander once again faced Lally Tollendal's Coote, weakened by disease, attrition, and dwindling supplies from prolonged fighting. To hold their positions, the French struggled, seizing the opportunity. A devastating assault was coordinated by Coote. By the end of the day, collapsed French resistance, and taken prisoner was Lally Tollendal. In North America, as the final French stronghold stood Montreal. In 1760, a multi-directional campaign to surround the city was orchestrated by General Jeffrey Amherst. Along the St. Lawrence River, down Lake Champlain, and north from Lake Ontario, British forces advanced. Overwhelmed and vastly outnumbered, crumbled the French defenses. On September 8, 1760, surrendered Montreal, ending French rule in Canada. Similar defeats were faced by the French in India. Along the Coromandel coast to the fortified city of Pondicherry, British forces laid siege, month after month. The defenses were battered by British artillery until on January 15, 1761, finally capitulated the city. Nearby French enclaves such as Karaikal and Yanam soon fell, followed by Mahe along the Malabar coast. Further inland, near Seringapatam in the Hyderabad region, British troops clashed with French and Mysorean forces. When the fighting ended, once again British arms prevailed, extinguishing French power across the Indian subcontinent. In the Caribbean, the British advance continued, where Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinica, St. Lucia, Grenada, and Havana were captured from French and Spanish control. Clear was the message. As the dominant global power, Britain now stood. From North America to the Caribbean to India, across the world flew the Union Jack. During peace negotiations in Paris, in a commanding position, Britain's military success placed it to Britain. Canada was agreed to be ceded by France, provided that religious rights were retained by French Catholics. Eager to recover Havana, a deal was struck by Spain to British control would pass Florida in exchange for the Masti city's return. In India, over Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, British dominance was reaffirmed. Yet at a steep cost came victory. Deeply in debt was Britain, and sought stability in North America. Along the Appalachian Mountains, the proclamation of 1763 drew a boundary, prohibiting westward colonial settlement. To prevent costly conflicts with Native American nations was the goal. Largely ignored, the restriction was by colonists, especially the Ohio Company tied to George Washington. Justified proved British fears as Pontiac, a war leader of the Odawa, rallied tribes into open resistance. In 1763, Fort Detroit was besieged by native forces, followed by attacks on Fort Michilimackinac and Fort Sandusky by Colonel Henry Bouquet. British forces eventually broke the siege of Fort Pitt after the fierce Battle of Bushy Run. Military action with diplomacy was combined by Pontiac, forging alliances to sustain the uprising. By 1764, however, weakened resistance began negotiations and returned peace in India after a century of interaction with the British East India Company. The Mughal Empire was collapsing through the Treaty of Paris and later the Treaty of Allahabad. In 1765, Dewani writes the authority to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa were secured by Britain, though in name Mughal sovereignty was preserved. Effectively British-controlled became these regions, still burdened by war debt to its American colonies for revenue turned Britain. Direct taxes on printed materials were imposed by the Stamp Act of 1765, sparking outrage under the rallying cry, "No taxation without representation," though repealed was the act. Through the Declaratory Act, Parliament asserted its authority, insisting that full power over the colonies was held by it. As Britain continued expanding elsewhere, tensions mounted. In 1768, aboard the HMS Endeavour, James Cook set sail, venturing into the uncharted South Pacific. In April 1770, the eastern coast of Australia was reached and mapped by Cook, later claiming it as New South Wales for Britain. All was inspired by this expanding empire. As once written by Governor George Macartney, it was an empire on which the sun never sets. Yet long shadows are often cast by brilliance. On July 4, 1776, independence was declared by the American colonies. Ideals of equality and liberty were laid out by the Declaration of Independence, while grievances against King George III were listed, with John Hancock's bold signature and those of others beside it. Revolution began. General George Washington and his Continental Army, ordinary citizens turned soldiers, now stood on the front lines, bearing the weight of a newborn nation and its fight for freedom. Deeply committed to the ideal of freedom they were. Yet the battle-hardened experience of the army they faced was lacked by them. Across the Atlantic, what he expected to be quick and decisive victory was being prepared by British General William Howe, a seasoned professional with a history of military success, intent on crushing the colonial uprising before it could fully take root, was Howe. Backed by disciplined British regulars, contracted Hessian troops, and loyalist supporters, for a dramatic showdown, the confrontation was set at dawn on August 27, 1776. By the chaos of war, the quiet countryside of Brooklyn was shattered, drawing on superior training and coordination. A clever flanking maneuver was carried out by British forces. Under the sudden pressure, American defenses collapsed, forcing a retreat and allowing by the British control of New York to be regained. Yet by December, to concede defeat refused George Washington. On a Hessian encampment in Trenton, New Jersey, his sights were set, leading roughly 2,400 men. Perilous river crossing was launched by Washington, battling exhaustion and ice. Choked waters, the New Jersey shoreline was reached by them. Under the cover of darkness toward Trenton they advanced, with muskets loaded, driven forward by determination, surprise, and the promise of a dawn attack. As December 26th began, struck the Continental Army, completely unprepared. To respond, the Hessian forces scrambled, their firearms, damp from the cold, misfired and failed them. Meanwhile, through the frosty air, commands were barked by American officers. Overwhelmed and strategically outmatched, surrendered the Hessians, handing to the Americans a vital victory. But far from over was the war. In September 1777, a strategy aimed at cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies was unveiled by British General John Burgoyne. In his way stood American commanders Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. At Saratoga, the confrontation came to a head. where dramatically the fate of the war would shift. The first major clash at Freeman's Farm saw American forces hold their ground, inflicting heavy losses. Battered and weakened emerged Burgoyne's army. Weeks later at Bemis Heights, a crushing blow was delivered by the Americans, defying expectations. With relentless determination, British assaults were repelled by the Continental forces. On October 17th, stunned and defeated, his entire army was surrendered by Burgoyne. A decisive triumph had been secured by the Americans. Across the globe, word of Saratoga echoed, reaching the halls of Versailles and Paris, still smarting from France's humiliation in the 7 Years' War. An opportunity to strike Britain was recognized by King Louis XVI. That the American cause was viable proved Saratoga, armed with this proof, successfully by Benjamin Franklin. France was persuaded to openly join the war against their shared enemy. During the siege of Yorktown in 1781, this Franco-American alliance proved decisive. On the Yorktown Peninsula, his army had been positioned by British General Lord Charles Cornwallis, confident in its defensibility, access to the York River. He believed ensured naval support or evacuation if needed. Unbeknownst to him, from all sides, events were closing in. When of Cornwallis' position, George Washington and French General Jean-Baptiste Rochambeau learned. Swiftly to encircle Yorktown they moved. As September progressed, to sense the danger British forces began, steadily advanced thousands of Allied troops, with their footsteps echoing closer each day. From the sea came the greatest shock, defeated by French naval forces was the British fleet, cutting off Cornwallis's lifeline. No longer escape routes were the York River and Chesapeake Bay barriers they became. With relentless intensity, the siege tightened, day after day. By American and French artillery, British defenses were battered, dwindled supplies, collapsed morale, and faded hope. By mid-October, hopeless was Cornwallis's situation. Shattered were his fortifications, demoralized his men, and sealed all avenues of retreat. On the morning of October 17th, a white flag was raised. Terms were requested by Cornwallis, and surrender was made. 2 years later, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. As an independent nation, the United States was officially recognized, with a defined border separating it from British Canada. Neighboring states had become former enemies. While America had been lost by Britain, in India, its power continued to expand. With famine gripping Bengal and other regions, financial pressures intensified. In 1784, through the East India Company Act, Britain's role in India was reshaped. By Prime Minister William Pitt, financial authority over Bengal, Madras, and Bombay was retained by the company, while into the hands of a secret 6-member council, appointed by the Crown, the Board of Political Control was placed. Learning from the American experience, behind closed doors with minimal transparency, this governing body operated. Near absolute authority over territories, it scarcely understood was wielded by the board, with America no longer a destination for transported prisoners. Alternatives were sought by Britain. Recently charted, Australia became the answer. In 1787, a fleet of 1,400 people, half convicts, half free settlers toward New South Wales, was led by Captain Arthur Phillip. On May 13th, Portsmouth was departed from by the fleet, traveling over 24,000 kilometers before Botany Bay was reached. Once ashore, unsuitable was realized by Phillip to be Botany Bay. Exposed was the harbor, shallow the water, scarce fresh water, and infertile the soil. Wary of the newcomers were the local Eora people, resisted clearing in dense hardwood forests. Tools broke, and from the ground, trees had to be blasted. Exploring further north, Port Jackson at Sydney Cove was discovered by Phillip. With deep, sheltered waters and better conditions, famously, he described it as the finest harbor in the world. On January 26, 1788, There the fleet relocated, establishing Sydney Cove later, commemorated as Australia Day. Despite this, plagued by famine was the settlement. Against the harsh climate and unfamiliar environment, the colonists struggled, yet continued transporting prisoners did Britain, expanding a colony that barely survived. Meanwhile, transformation underwent Canada. Following the American Revolution, North fled loyalists and freed slaves, while their culture sought to be preserved by French Canadians. To ease tensions, the Constitution Act of 1791 was passed by Parliament, dividing Canada into Upper and Lower Canada. British in language, law, and religion became Upper Canada, while French civil law, Catholicism, and language were preserved by Lower Canada. Freedom, but not equality, was found by former slaves who resettled in Canada. Facing poverty and discrimination, abolitionist John Clarkson's proposal to establish Freetown in Sierra Leone was accepted by many. In February 1792, Nova Scotia was departed from by over 1,100 former slaves, founding a new settlement on Africa's coast. At the southern tip of Africa, from the Dutch, the Cape Colony was seized by British forces, recognizing its strategic importance as a gateway to the East Indies. Elsewhere, in 1798, Ireland erupted in rebellion. Suppression of Gaelic culture and Catholic faith fueled resistance. Through victories and losses, rebels were led by a farmer named Sean O'Brien. Briefly raised hopes by French intervention, but crushed the uprising did superior British forces. In India, against British dominance, French assistance was sought by Tipu Sultan of Mysore, but alone he stood when never arrived aid. His correspondence was uncovered by British intelligence, prompting Governor-General Richard Wellesley to act. With the Nizam of Hyderabad and the Marathas allied, on Mysore British forces closed in. In May 1799, Seringapatam was besieged by the British. After days of brutal combat, fell the fortress. Defending his city was Tipu Sultan killed. Dismantled was Mysore, divided its lands, and under British control, the Wodeyar dynasty was restored. Onward marched the British Empire, reshaping the world through conquest, control, and consequence. With the collapse of the Irish Rebellion, a permanent solution, one that would ensure Ireland could never rise in revolt again, was sought by British leaders. Through political union, the answer came. On the eve of January 1st, 1801, formally absorbed into the United Kingdom was Ireland. The British Parliament, which already represented England, Scotland, and Wales, now included Ireland for the first time. Dissolved was the Irish Parliament, with its authority folded into Westminster. Under a single political entity, one union, one Great Britain, four kingdoms were bound together at the same time. Far from satisfied were British ambitions in India. His drive to expand British dominance across the subcontinent continued by Major General Richard Wellesley. On September 23, 1803, with just 7,000 soldiers across the Kitna River, Wellesley marched, confronting the fractured Maratha Confederacy. Against him arrayed was a force exceeding 40,000 men, supported by an unknown number of war elephants. Initially, a flanking maneuver was attempted by British commanders, only to realize that the full weight of the Maratha army was being faced, forcing a direct confrontation. Famous for their fast-moving cavalry and effective guerrilla-style warfare were the Marathas. Immense pressure on British infantry formations, which struggled to maintain defensive squares, was placed by their sudden cavalry charges. While relentlessly thundered Maratha artillery, battering the advancing British lines. Yet two decisive advantages were held by the British: the rigorous discipline of their troops and superior coordination between infantry and artillery. As the fighting escalated, with deadly accuracy, British guns began striking, tearing gaps through Maratha formations. Over several days, on both sides casualties mounted. Ultimately, to retreat and accept the Treaty of Diagana, Emiratas were forced. Under its terms, territory north of the Warta River, including Gawalgar and Narnala, as well as the district of Cuttack, was ceded by Ragosi II to British control, while overseas its influence was expanded by Britain, closer to home danger. Loomed. In Europe, an unprecedented threat was posed by Napoleon Bonaparte, now Emperor of France. Driven by ambition, domination over the continent was sought by Napoleon. To achieve this, mastery of the seas and the destruction of Britain's naval blockade were needed by him. In the port of Cadiz, a combined French and Spanish fleet waited, preparing to clear the English Channel and open the path for a French invasion of Britain. But fully aware of their intentions was Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson. As dawn broke, from aboard HMS Victory commanding, a daring and unconventional decision was made by Nelson. Rejecting traditional naval doctrine, he ordered his fleet to split into two columns and charge directly into the Franco-Spanish line. A gamble that risked total annihilation it was. By cannons, the calm of the morning was shattered. As the opposing fleets collided, smoke and chaos engulfed the sea. Most notably, Victory and Temeraire British ships plunged into the enemy line. Designed to cut the opposing fleet into disarray, raking formation and sowing confusion was Nelson's strategy. Hour by hour, British seamanship, training, and tactical superiority became evident. Boarded, captured, or blasted into wrecks were enemy ships. By sunset, clear was the outcome. Secured had been British naval supremacy, and shattered Napoleon's dreams of invading Britain. When direct military victory proved impossible, to commerce, the battlefield was shifted by Napoleon. In 1806, the Berlin Decree was issued by him, declaring the British Isles under perpetual blockade and banning all trade with Great Britain. Swiftly, Britain responded with the Orders in Council. Under British control, any colony was forbidden from trading with France. Seized were vessels that obeyed Napoleon's decree or attempted to evade British enforcement. Entirely blockaded were ports that complied with the continental system. Thus began a global struggle fought through embargoes. And economic warfare. Once again, the course of history was altered by Britain. In 1807, the abolition of the Slave Trade Act was passed by Parliament. Participation in the international slave trade throughout the British Empire was outlawed by the legislation. However, legal remained slavery itself. Continued ownership of enslaved people only, the trade across borders was prohibited. During the Napoleonic Wars, much of Britain's fighting unfolded on the Iberian Peninsula and at sea. Repeated clashes between British and French forces marked battles such as Rolica, Vimeiro, and Corunna. Thinly stretched across Europe, sufficient resources to decisively challenge Britain lacked Napoleon. At British hands, repeated destruction suffered his navy. Despite battlefield successes, a constant flow of manpower was required by the Royal Navy. Between 1807 and 1812, roughly 400 American merchant ships, under the Orders in Council, were seized by British authorities. Into British service, their crews and vessels were pressed. Simultaneously, American commerce was strangled by competing French and British trade restrictions, cutting the young nation off from European markets. On June 18, 1812, on Britain, war was declared by the United States. Freedom of the seas and fair access to international trade were demanded by the Americans. Into Upper Canada, American forces were led by General William Hull, aiming to capture the territory. Failed the campaign, and to Fort Detroit Hull retreated. Sensing opportunity, working alongside Shawnee warriors, led by Tecumseh, British Major General Isaac Brock advanced on the fort. A masterful deception was orchestrated by Tecumseh, having his warriors march repeatedly in and out of forest cover, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. Through the woods, war cries echoed, amplifying fear among the defenders. By demanding Hull's surrender, implying that once fighting began, native warriors might be impossible to restrain. Psychological pressure was added by Brock. Terrified and convinced he was hopelessly outmatched, capitulated Hull on August 16, 1812. Without a single British cannon being fired, Fort Detroit was surrendered. Not improved in American fortunes. On January 18, 1813, an attempt to retake Detroit was made by a U.S. force. Short-lived was initial success. On January 22nd, a combined force of British, Canadian, and native warriors was led by British Colonel Henry Proctor in a sudden assault. Erupted gunfire, shouting, and war cries, shattering the winter stillness. Almost immediately, the American left flank collapsed. The following day, surrendered American forces. Ignored was their capitulation, and on the spot by native fighters many were killed. Infuriated, struck back American forces. On April 27th, the British capital of Upper Canada, York, modern-day Toronto, was attacked by them. To overwhelm British defenses, superior numbers allowed the Americans, but quickly unraveled discipline. Against orders, the town was looted by troops and buildings set on fire, including the provincial parliament. A year later, followed British retribution. At the Battle of Bladensburg in Maryland, despite its numerical superiority and defensive positions, an American army was crushed by British forces. Open lay the road to Washington, D.C. Cautiously, British troops entered the capital, expecting resistance. Instead, largely deserted found they the city. Public and government buildings, the Capitol, the White House, and others were deliberately set ablaze. For miles visible, the night sky was illuminated by flames. Brief was the occupation. The following day, British forces withdrew. As under devastating defeats, particularly in Russia, Napoleon's empire collapsed. The Treaty of Paris in 1814 was signed by him, restoring the French monarchy under King Louis XVIII, sending reinforcements. To North America was considered by Britain, but too defiant to ever be governed again, concluded the Americans were. On December 24, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. To their original owners, all conquered territories were returned. Unchanged remained borders. Reaffirmed was American independence, and confirmed Canada's permanent separation from the United States. Once more to Asia, specifically the Himalayan kingdom of Nepal, ruled by the legendary Gurkha warriors. British attention turned, celebrated for their bravery and martial skill. Aggressively had the Gurkhas expanded to the south. As a crucial buffer against potential Chinese expansion, Nepal was viewed by the British East India Company. On the Terai region, a fertile strip between the Himalayan foothills and the Indian plains, tensions centered. Escalating border disputes led the East India Company to declare war in 1814. At Nalapani near Dehradun, the first major clash occurred. With exceptional skill, the fortress was defended by Gurkha commander Amar Singh Thapa, holding off British attacks for over a month. Unfamiliar with mountain warfare, and having underestimated their opponent, repeated setbacks were suffered by British forces. Guerrilla tactics and intimate terrain knowledge were used by the Gurkhas to their advantage. Yet British numerical superiority, advanced weaponry, and logistical depth proved decisive, as key areas including the Kathmandu Valley came under threat. Faltered Nepal's resistance. By early 1815, unavoidable was the outcome. To the Treaty of Shigoli, negotiations led. Large portions of its eastern and western territories were surrendered by Nepal, permanently redrawing regional borders. Meanwhile, weakening was the Maratha Confederacy. Seeing an opportunity, the final blow was prepared by the British. Little real power after earlier treaties was held by the Maratha Peshwa, Baji Rao II, whose title meant foremost leader. Fractured had Maratha unity. Their own ambitions were pursued by the Holkars, Bansals, Scindias, and Gakwads, undermining collective resistance. These divisions were exploited by British Governor-General Lord Hastings. When secretly his forces were being rebuilt by Baji Rao, the second violating treaty agreements was revealed by intelligence. Preemptively moved Hastings at Khadki near Pune, with Maratha forces. British troops under General Smith clashed. After fierce fighting prevailed, the British capturing Pune and crippling Peshwa authority. Elsewhere, fighting continued. In Nagpur, at Sitabaldi, the British were confronted by Raghojee II Bansal. Vicious was the battle, with heavy casualties on both sides, but British discipline and equipment secured victory. In central India, through multiple engagements, stubbornly fought the Holkars. Yet British persistence gradually eroded resistance. Neutrality was chosen by the Scindias of Gwalior. For Maratha cohesion, this decision proved devastating. In 1818, the collapse of the Confederacy was finalized by the Treaty of Mandsaur. Annexed were Maratha territories, abolished the Peshwa title, and to Bithar exiled Baji Rao II, bringing an era to an end as eastward British influence expanded. A strategic maritime hub in Southeast Asia was sought by the empire. With finding a suitable location for a trading post, Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles was tasked. To Singapore, ideally situated at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, overlooking the vital Strait of Malacca, his search led him. A deep natural harbor, abundant fresh water, and timber for ship repairs were offered by the island. On January 29, 1819, Raffles arrived. With that landing, into the orbit of the British Empire, Singapore entered, becoming one of its most important gateways into Asia. While in India operating, far from satisfied remained British ambitions. Toward Burma, ruled by the Konbaung dynasty, which as a direct obstacle to further expansion was viewed by London, their attention soon turned in 1824, when the island of Shalpuri was occupied by Burmese forces. Tensions escalated. To British officials, the opening moved toward deeper Burmese incursions into Bengal. This appeared to be, in response, a swift and decisive counterstrike was launched by Britain. Initiated was a two-front invasion, and the vital port city of Rangoon was rapidly seized by British forces. That the capture of such a critical hub would compel Burma to negotiate was believed by British commanders. Instead, to yield refused the Konbaung dynasty. Rather than an open battle confronting the British, tactics were shifted by Burmese forces. Into the dense jungle they melted. Guerrilla warfare was waged, and by monsoon rains, disease, and unfamiliar terrain, much of the work was allowed to be done for them. For nearly 2 years, the stage for a relentless game of pursuit and evasion became Burma's forests. With neither side willing to concede, despite their technological superiority and naval dominance. Against the harsh environment and persistent resistance, British troops struggled. Eventually, exhaustion and depletion on both sides forced diplomacy. In 1826, the Treaty of Yandabo was produced by negotiations over Assam, Manipur, Kakar, and Jaintia. British authority was formally acknowledged by Burma, while Arakan and the coastal regions of Tenasserim were surrendered, also imposed was a substantial indemnity in silver, placing heavy strain on the Burmese treasury. Back in Britain, unrest of a different kind, cultural and religious divisions long embedded in society, was faced by Parliament. In 1829, the Roman Catholic Relief Act was passed by lawmakers, permitting Catholics to legally serve in Parliament for the first time. Almost immediately, in the House of Commons, Irish Catholic leader Daniel O'Connell took his seat after centuries of warfare, displacement, and religious discrimination between Anglicans and Catholics. Toward reconciliation, progress had begun. Slowly across the British Isles, tolerance was growing. That tolerance, however, to indigenous peoples overseas did not extend. Van Diemen's Land modern-day Tasmania for thousands of years had been home to the Palawa people. British settlement and the rapidly increasing settler population pushed the Palawa toward starvation and displacement in desperate attempts to survive. Settler farms for food were occasionally raided by Palawa groups. With violence, settlers responded, escalating tensions on both sides. Over time, more frequent and more brutal clashes became. Across the colony, accounts of kidnappings, killings, and armed confrontations spread. The Black War is what settlers came to refer to this period as violence intensified. Martial law was declared by Lieutenant Governor George Arthur, granting settlers permission to kill Palawa people on sight. In 1830, a massive operation known as the Black Line was launched by colonial authorities. A human chain intended to sweep across the island and force the remaining Palawa population onto the Tasman Peninsula. Isolating them from the rest of the colony was formed by settlers, convicts, and soldiers. Costly and largely ineffective, the operation proved. By 1831, under the pretense of Christian protection, to Flinders Island the surviving Palawa were relocated. There, disease, starvation, and despair claimed the lives of most of them. Rarely in simple moral terms does history present itself. On August 28, 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act was passed by Parliament. The gradual emancipation of enslaved people across the British Empire was mandated by this legislation, with the process completed within 6 years. At the same time, £20 million, roughly £2 billion today, was allocated by the government to compensate slave owners for their losses. None of this money was received by former slaves. Instead, without land, wealth, or support, they were released, forced to survive on their own. In 1835, a site unknown to fellow colonists claimed to have been discovered by an Australian settler named John Batman, which Batmania he named, through what became known as Batman's Treaty. He asserted that 600,000 acres from the local Kulin nation had been purchased by him. Widely considered dubious, the agreement exchanged trivial goods for vast expanses of land. The following year, officially proclaimed, was the colony of South Australia, and amid ceremonial celebration, the city of Adelaide was founded. To the east in New South Wales, deeper into unexplored territory, pushed Major Thomas Mitchell, describing fertile landscapes that inspired waves of settlers seeking opportunity. By 1837, the colony of Victoria, named after Queen Victoria, was formally established. Melbourne was Batmania renamed. Across the world in China, into serious resistance ran British trade ambitions. Immense was the British appetite for Chinese tea, fueling demand across the empire, but little to offer China in exchange had Britain except opium grown in India. Devastated by the drug was Chinese society, and eliminated entirely sought the Qing government to enforce this policy. Lin Zexu, a determined official committed to eradicating the opium trade, was appointed by the Qing dynasty. Uncompromising was his approach. Seize and destroy. Along the shores of Guangzhou, massive stockpiles of confiscated opium were burned, sending thick smoke into the sky. As an unmistakable warning was the act meant no longer would China tolerate the trade, as an assault on its commercial interests. This was viewed by Britain. In response, to protect British trade, the Royal Navy, equipped with steam-powered gunboats and iron-hulled ships, was deployed. Battlegrounds became China's coastal waters as near key ports skirmishes erupted. Quickly, by British naval superiority, Qing defenses, which relied on outdated military traditions, were overwhelmed. As along the coast British forces advanced, collapsed resistance. In Nanking, negotiations followed, overwhelmingly favored Britain. The resulting Treaty of Nanking ceded was Hong Kong by China. A large indemnity paid. To British trade, its ports opened, and to legalize the sale of opium compelled. South of Australia lay New Zealand, an island of striking beauty. That attracted increasing numbers of British settlers. But already inhabited by the Maori was the land, an indigenous people with deep roots stretching back centuries. With securing British sovereignty over the islands, Lieutenant Governor William Hobson was tasked, in English within days, the Treaty of Waitangi was drafted by him, and later into Maori it was translated. On February 6th, to debate the agreement, approximately 500 Maori gathered, believing that the same meaning was conveyed by both versions. They did not. In the English text, sovereignty was ceded by Maori leaders to Britain. Exclusive rights to purchase land were granted to the Crown. Ownership of their lands and resources was retained, and the rights of British subjects were received. However, in the Maori translation, as Kawanatanga, meaning governance sovereignty, was rendered, administrative authority, not absolute power, was what they believed they were granting. Another discrepancy involved land ownership. While undisturbed possession of property was guaranteed by the English version, Tino Rangatiratanga, Taonga meaning full authority over treasured things, including intangible resources, was emphasized by the Maori text. To believe they held exclusive land purchasing rights, these differences led the British, while to believe they retained full control led the Maori. T40 Maori chiefs, including Honhek, signed the treaty. Their interpretation was enforced by British authorities over time. Under European legal concepts unfamiliar to Maori society, land was sold, soon realized the consequences by Honheke. Vanished had Maori independence in defiance. The Union Jack atop Maiki Hill was cut down by Heka, and his allies not once, but 4 times. The center of conflict became the settlement of Kororaka, now Russell. In March 1845, a coordinated assault was launched by Honheke and Chief Te Ruki Kawiti. While by Heke British and allied Maori forces were engaged, the town itself was struck by Kawiti. Through the streets, musket fire echoed as from the harbor HMS Hazard fired, when by a Maori marksman the ship's captain was killed. Shifted the balance into chaos fell Kororaka, withdrew British forces, evacuating civilians as parts of the settlement were engulfed by fires. After multiple engagements, reinforcements began to be dispatched by the British. Recognizing that far from finished was the war, back in India, crisis faced the Sikh Empire of Punjab, following the death of Maharaja Ranjit Singh to the Khalsa army. Power shifted, transforming the state into a military-led regime. Toward the Sutlej River, the boundary with British India, Sikh forces advanced, prompting alarm in British leadership. At Mudkee in December 1845, the first clash came. Under Sir Hugh Gough and Governor-General Sir Henry Hardinge, British troops engaged Sikh forces. Superior artillery delivered victory, but heavy were British casualties. Days later at Feroz Shah, another brutal 2-day battle unfolded. On the first day, due to exhaustion and low ammunition, nearly collapsed. British forces, on the second, reinforcements and a renewed offensive secured victory. The Treaty of Lahore followed. The territory between the Bees and Sutlej rivers was surrendered by the Sikhs. Reparations paid, and a British resident in Lahore accepted, however. Temporary was peace, to reclaim lost lands. Sikh leaders including Maharaja Duleep Singh and Diwan Mulrai sought. After renewed conflict, the decisive Battle of Dudrit took place. Devastating bombardments were unleashed by British artillery, followed by coordinated infantry and cavalry. Attacks broke Sikh resistance. In March 1849, by the Second Treaty of Lahore, Sikh independence was formally dissolved. Deposed was Duleep Singh, and into British India Punjab was annexed. Even this was not enough. Complete dominance over India was sought by British leaders. The doctrine of lapse was introduced by Governor-General Lord James Dalhousie, declaring that any dependent state without a biological heir or ruled incompetently would be annexed. In Jhansi, no surviving biological children had Maharaja Gangadhar Rao and his queen Rani Lakshmibai. Before his death, a son Damodar Rao was adopted by the Maharaja. As heir, the child was presented by Rani Lakshmibai, but rejected was the claim by Dalhousie. Invoking the doctrine of lapse, Jhansi was annexed by Britain, stripped of its sovereignty and setting the stage for rebellion, territories and princely. States such as Satara, Jaipur, Sambalpur, Nagaur, and Awadh were all absorbed using this policy. At the time, heavily on Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, relied the British East India Company's army, poorly paid, routinely disrespected, and increasingly resentful of British authority were these men. Steadily grew their dissatisfaction. In March 1857, at Barrackpur, a sepoy named Mangal Pandey openly rebelled against his British superiors. Swiftly punished was his act of defiance, and by hanging he was executed. But already done was the damage. Lit had been the spark. On May 10, 1857, in Meerut, the unrest exploded when 85 sepoys mutinied. Formation was broken by them, the prison stormed, and their jailed comrades freed. Rapidly escalated their fury. Throughout the cantonment, British officers, European civilians, and Indian Christians were killed. Torched were buildings, and by nightfall, into chaos, Meerut had descended, aware they could not defend the garrison. Town to move on many rebels chose. Through the night toward Delhi they marched, reaching the city the next day, completely off guard. Their arrival caught the small British garrison. In Delhi stationed, local Indian troops joined the uprising. Along with large segments of the civilian population, British officials, civilians, and anyone tied to East India Company rule began to be targeted by the rebels. Before long, the Red Fort home of the Mughal Emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was seized by them, yet no intention of conceding defeat had the British. By early June, outside Delhi, British reinforcements composed of European troops and loyal Indian regiments assembled. The city's massive defenses were assessed by General Archdale Wilson with both caution and resolve. Fall had to Delhi. For those inside the city, more than a military objective was holding Delhi. Honor, heritage, and the hope of independence symbolized it. With optimism and determination, the streets buzzed, but soon tested would be that optimism. On the ridge, a strategic high ground north of the city, positioned British artillery began a relentless bombardment. With its own guns, Delhi answered, filling the sky with smoke and thunder. In early September, finally breached by the British, was the city. A daring assault on the Kashmir Gate was led by General John Nicholson, blasting through its defenses with explosives. Once inside, brutal urban combat followed. Deadly battle zones became narrow alleyways. From rooftops, rebel snipers fired. With bayonets, British troops advanced. And day after day, relentless street fighting raged. Every inch of Chandni Chowk and every gate of the Red Fort witnessed acts of courage and cruelty alike. By September 20th, fully regained control had British forces. Once more into British hands, the Red Fort fell, and soon after captured was Bahadur Shah Zafar, true symbol of the rebellion. Both the collapse of the uprising in Delhi and the final chapter of the Mughal dynasty were marked by his arrest. Swift and unforgiving was British retaliation. In large numbers, rebels were executed, and left damaged and deserted were entire sections of Delhi. Across much of the Indian subcontinent, the rebellion had spread, but as in Delhi, crushed resistance and forced surrender to British forces. With the fighting over, a Government of India Act of 1858 was enacted by Britain. Dissolved was the British East India Company, and directly under the authority of Queen Victoria, India was placed. Ended the illusion of corporate governance. Unmistakably a British colony was now India. Under the Crown, a Council of India was created, comprising 15 members, none of whom spoke native Indian languages. Sweeping authority over Indian political affairs was granted to it. As regional governors, British officials were installed to educate the colonial elite and reinforce British dominance. English-language schools were established, politically, economically, and socially. Their grip was tightened by the British. In their view, alone justified their rule over the subcontinent. Did British identity, under the Raj, only intensified that dominance. In New Zealand, a similar pattern of dispossession was encountered by the Maori in 1863. The New Zealand Settlements Act was passed by the British government, allowing land confiscation from Maori tribes deemed to be in rebellion. Despite efforts by Maori groups to unite and resist during conflicts such as the Waikato War, the Taranaki Wars, and Te Kouti's War, overwhelming proved British military power across the globe in Jamaica, long after slavery had been abolished. Deeply unequal remained the island. Impoverished former slaves consisted of most of the population. To land ownership tied were voting rights. And during the 1864 election, fewer than 2,000 black men were eligible to vote out of a black population of 420,000, while around 10,000 men retained suffrage. Amid a devastating drought and outbreaks of cholera and smallpox, this occurred on October 11, 1865, after a minor incident outside the Morant Bay courthouse escalated dramatically. Tensions exploded for trespassing on an abandoned plantation. A black man was arrested. When a bystander protested, to detain him, police attempted, triggering clashes. Hundreds from Stony Gut were led by Baptist deacon and activist Paul Bogle in a march to Morant Bay. Erupted violence. Burned was the courthouse, and officials and militia members were killed. By declaring martial law, Governor Edward John Eyre responded. Over the following weeks, as many as 1,000 black Jamaicans were killed by British forces. Flogged or brutally punished were many others. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon, a mixed-race legislator critical of Eyre, were hastily tried and executed. In the rebellion's aftermath, the Jamaican House of Assembly was dissolved by Britain and direct colonial rule installed. Meanwhile, in North America, its colonies were reorganized by Britain, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and British Columbia were unified into a single political entity, the Dominion of Canada. In West Africa, that British territorial control could be challenged, believed the Ashanti people of the Gold Coast, modern Ghana. Between the Ashanti and the British, the Fant region lay, serving as a buffer zone. As part of their sphere of influence, the Ashanti viewed the region, while as under its protection, Britain regarded it, soon collapsed that fragile balance. Under King Kofi Karakari, into Fant territory, a campaign was launched by the Ashanti, laying siege to the coastal fort of Elmina, on Cape Coast, the British colonial capital. Pressure mounted. Swift was the British response. With reinforcements, Sir Garnet Wolseley, a seasoned commander armed with modern rifles and artillery, arrived at Amaful, a fortified Ashanti stronghold. The decisive confrontation took place. To stage deadly ambushes, dense underbrush was exploited by Ashanti warriors, using superior terrain knowledge to their advantage. By advancing in multiple columns, encircling the defenders, countered Wolseley. By dusk, after intense fighting, fell Amaful and Ashanti forces retreated. The following year, the Treaty of Fumno was signed by Kofi Karakari, renouncing Ashanti claims to Fant lands and agreeing to abdicate. A British protectorate became Ashanti territory, retaining limited internal autonomy. Surrender over destruction was chosen by some rulers. In the Pacific, mounting debts, internal unrest, and the threat of forced annexation faced Chief Kakabao of Fiji. That stability could be ensured and rival colonial claims prevented by British protection, believed he. So voluntarily sovereignty was ceded by him. On October 10, 1874, formally joined the British Empire did Fiji. Through finance rather than warfare came other acquisitions. In 1869, through a French-Egyptian partnership, the Suez Canal was completed, revolutionizing global trade by drastically shortening the route to India, but into crippling debt. Construction plunged Egypt £4 million to purchase 44% of canal shares, worth approximately £378 million today, was raised by British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Completed in 1875, decisive influence over the canal was handed to Britain by the deal. Sometimes, outright was resistance demanded. In December 1878, an ultimatum to Zulu King Cetshwayo was issued by Sir Henry Bartle Frere, insisting that their military be dismantled by the Zulu or war-faced. To fight chose Cetshwayo. On January 22, 1879, at Isandlwana, the two armies clashed. Using traditional tactics, the British camp was overwhelmed by Zulu Impi forces, with more than 1,300 soldiers killed in one of Britain's worst colonial defeats. But eventually prevailed technological superiority. At Kambula and Gingindhavu, defeats turned the tide on July 4th. At Ulundi, the final blow was delivered by British forces, capturing the Zulu capital and consolidating British dominance in southern Africa. Yet new resistance faced British control. In December 1880, independent the Transvaal was declared by Boer settlers, utilizing guerrilla tactics and intimate terrain knowledge. Humiliating defeats on British forces at Bronkhorstspruit and Majuba Hill they inflicted. Following mounting losses, the Treaty of Pretoria in March 1881 was signed by Britain, restoring Transvaal self-rule under British suzerainty. Egypt, once a cradle of ancient civilization, now lay indebted to foreign lenders. Alm-B Arabi, a charismatic officer of humble origins, rose to challenge the ruling elite. Witnessing daily inequality and foreign exploitation, officers and civilians alike were rallied by him. What began as military dissent evolved into a nationalist revolt demanding Egyptian sovereignty. Britain, fearing loss of control over the Suez Canal, in 1882 intervened. At Tel El Kebir, Arabi's army was decisively crushed by British forces. To India exiled was Arabi, and a de facto British protectorate became Egypt. On November 15, 1884, the Berlin Conference was convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck to formalize rules for colonizing Africa. 14 European powers met, with no African representation present, as a map to be divided the continent was treated through diplomacy, treaties, and trade-offs. Vast territorial claims were secured by Britain, cementing dominance across eastern and southern Africa. As borders were drawn, conflict with African societies followed, easily overwhelmed traditional warriors by British forces armed with Maxim guns. Under Cecil Rhodes, Bulawayo was captured by British troops, and Rhodesia, the territory renamed. In 1896, rebellions were crushed with brutal force. In 1897, in the Kingdom of Benin, continued British aggression, without authorization. Toward Benin City during a sacred period, Consul James Phillips marched and was ambushed and killed. Swift and devastating would be Britain's retaliation, by Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, equipped with Maxim guns. With purpose, his forces were organized. Unmistakable was the mission: avenge James Phillips and formally absorb the Kingdom of Benin. Armed with assegais, and relying on centuries-old combat traditions, no real chance against modern British firepower stood Benin's warriors. Within mere weeks, in flames lay the grand city of Benin. Seized and transported overseas were its sacred bronzes, paraded as spoils of imperial conquest. Officially into the British Empire was the Kingdom of Benin, absorbed. Yet friction, these imperial boundary lines often created not only with indigenous peoples but with rival European powers. The isolated settlement of Fashoda in Sudan, a territory Britain considered firmly under its claim, was one such flashpoint. That did not deter French Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand from raising the yawl. French flag there upon arrival. When the tricolor flying was seen by British General Sir Herbert Kitchener, immediately the seriousness of the provocation was recognized. A tense deadlock followed. Both Marchand and Kitchener understood that along the Nile, one stray bullet could ignite war between two global empires, something neither side truly wanted. Under the sweltering heat, face to face the two commanders met. France's grueling expedition and territorial claim was outlined by Marchand, while Britain's strategic dominance over the Nile basin was emphasized by Kitchener, despite the stakes. Mutual respect defined their exchange, both men acutely aware of the consequences hanging in the balance. Back in Europe, through government chambers, word of the Fashoda incident reverberated. Neither France nor Britain was willing to fight over a distant outpost. Where weapons did not, diplomacy took over, unfolded negotiations, and eventually, to withdraw France agreed, bringing an end to its ambitions of expanding eastward across Africa. Meanwhile, in South Africa's vast grasslands, gold discoveries intensified tensions with the Boers. By October 1899, into full-scale war these disputes erupted. Masters of their environment, heavily on guerrilla tactics, relied the Boers early. Successes were achieved by them, laying siege to British-held towns such as Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. Having underestimated their opponents, caught off guard were British commanders. Farmers by livelihood yet seasoned fighters by necessity, the Boers excelled in hit-and-run warfare, striking swiftly before vanishing into the landscape. Against this approach, conventional military doctrine failed, forcing British leadership to rethink its strategy, determined to crush resistance. A harsh policy known as scorched earth was authorized by Field Marshal Lord Roberts, followed by General Lord Kitchener. Systematically burned were Boer farms, destroyed crops, and erased livelihoods. Further escalated the campaign to prevent civilians from aiding fighters. Boer families, mostly women, children, and elderly, were forcibly relocated by the British into concentration camps. Wholly unprepared for large populations were these camps. Rapidly spread disease, starvation, and poor sanitation, typhoid, and malnutrition killed tens of thousands, though staggering was the humanitarian cost. Gradually, Boer resistance was broken by the strategy. In May 1902, after years of brutal fighting, an agreement was reached by both sides. Signed was the Treaty of Vereniging, and part of the British Empire, the Boer republics became, as the 20th century dawned, across the globe from Canada to Jamaica, from Africa to Asia, and deep into the Pacific the British Empire stretched. The embodiment of the phrase had become Britain. The sun never sets on the empire. In 1907, at the Imperial Conference, its imperial relationships were attempted to be redefined by Britain. Expanded self-governing powers were granted to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland, though allegiance to the crown remained intact that same year. Into spheres of influence, Persia was divided by the Anglo-Russian Convention. Russia in the north, Britain in the southeast, and a neutral zone between them, soon captured British interest in the Middle East, particularly when in Masjid-i-Sulaiman. In 1908, massive oil reserves were discovered, buried deep beneath the desert. Untold wealth was promised by this discovery. By 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was established, and within half an hour, its stock offering sold out. Tighter control over the region was sought by Britain, especially as the neighboring Ottoman Empire showed signs of weakness. Opportunity demanded expansion, and through World War that opportunity would arrive. By many, the outbreak of World War I is attributed to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. Yet at its core, a global struggle over empire was the war. The Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, clashed with the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. For expansion, survival, or dominance, each power fought to Europe. The British Expeditionary Force was deployed, confronting. German troops at Mons, though initially held firm by them, soon the Western Front was defined by trench warfare. Seeking alternative routes to victory, the Gallipoli campaign was launched by the Allies, hoping to cripple the Ottomans by securing the Dardanelles. Instead, into a bloody stalemate it devolved. Behind closed doors, for the post-war Middle East plans were drafted by Britain and France. The Sykes-Picot Agreement. To France would go Syria and Lebanon. To Britain, Jordan, Iraq, and much of Israel, battles like the Somme, Arras, and Passchendaele came and went, each marked by unimaginable loss. Ultimately failed Germany's final gamble. The Spring Offensive pushed them back the 100 Days Offensive, leading to the armistice in November 1918 of its colonies. Germany was stripped by the Treaty of Versailles. Stronger than ever emerged Britain, gaining territories in Africa and the Middle East. Its zenith had been reached by the empire, yet unknowingly begun had the sunset. Soon followed resistance in India, with the 1919 Rowlatt Act allowing arrests without trial. Outrage exploded. Jailed were leaders. Satyagraha, nonviolent resistance, grounded in truth, was introduced by Gandhi. Brutally tested that philosophy was by the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Its own struggle was pursued by Ireland, to the creation of the IRA and years of violence. Sinn Féin's rise led, ambush, reprisals, and destruction followed until ultimately divided was Ireland, back in India. Mass civil disobedience was ignited by the Salt March of 1930. Joined millions. With repression, the British responded, but soon followed reform. In 1935 came partial self-rule. Then came World War II on all fronts from Dunkirk to El Alamein. Normandy to Singapore, Britain fought. Came victory, but at a cost. Exhausted was the empire. By the late 1940s, independence movements surged. As free nations emerged India and Pakistan. As the 1950s dawned, with hope and determination stirred Africa. Ending was the era of empire in the Gold Coast, about self-determination and national purpose. Fiery speeches were delivered by Kwame Nkrumah. By 1957, flooded the streets of Accra crowds, dancing in celebration as a free nation. Ghana was born. Meanwhile in Malaya, deep within the lush rainforests, his people to unite was called upon by Tunku Abdul Rahman, a royal figure and political leader. In songs of hope and togetherness, voices rose, and in 1957, independence was achieved by Malaya, eventually forming the broader federation known as Malaysia. Yet rarely smooth was the path to freedom. On the island of Cyprus, between Greek and Greek, Turkish communities, long-standing tensions frequently erupted, often into violent confrontations, British troops drawing. By sudden outbreaks of unrest that threatened any lasting stability, the island's natural beauty was repeatedly eclipsed. As the 1960s unfolded, a dramatic transformation underwent Africa, across Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and beyond. New flags emblazoned with bold colors and symbols were raised. A new generation of African leaders emerged, educated locally and within the heart of the former empire, guiding their countries by blending ancestral traditions with modern political thought. Also stepped forward the Caribbean. In Jamaica, through the air, reggae rhythms pulsed, reflecting the island's hard-won independence. In Trinidad and Tobago, the arrival of a newly sovereign nation was announced by a vibrant mix of cultures. By the 1980s, far removed from Africa's plains and the Caribbean's shores, yet another challenge was faced by Britain. In Zimbabwe, formerly Southern Rhodesia, a protracted struggle against British authority was fought by Robert Mugabe and his guerrilla forces. An independent Zimbabwe was the outcome, though one marked by deep wounds that would take generations to mend. Perhaps the most symbolic chapter came in 1997 in the heart of Hong Kong. Slowly lowered was the Union Jack, replaced by China's red flag. Standing beside the city's leaders, witness was borne by Prince Charles as formally relinquished by Britain, was its last major overseas possession. As on the British Empire finally dips below the horizon, the sun, forever altered, remains the world it shaped. From land seized from indigenous peoples, to borders carved across Africa, to artifacts displayed in British museums, globally the legacy of colonization continues to echo, and as over London night falls, only time will tell what lies ahead for the United Kingdom. Even now, still unfolding is its story. And there you have it, the rise, the reign, and the fall of the British Empire, a story of ambition and exploitation, of breakthroughs and brutality, of power that once stretched across the globe and then slowly slipped away. What do you think about the empire's legacy? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Or is it impossible to separate progress from oppression? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to give this video a like, subscribe to History Vault, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another journey into our shared past. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one, and as always, keep exploring history.